Good morning. I call this hearing to order. A quorum is present, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Before we proceed, I'd like to go over some items for our remote hearing. First, if you are experiencing connectivity issues, please make sure you or your staff contact our designated technical support so those issues can be resolved immediately. Members participating remotely must continue to remain visible on camera for the duration of their participation in the hearing unless they experience connectivity issues or other technical problems that render the member unable to fully participate on camera. It is committee policy that members participating remotely will remain muted when not recognized, just like turning your microphone on and off during an in-person hearing. This is out of courtesy to all members on the committee, so that the background noise does not interfere with another member who is recognized to speak. When you are recognized, you will need to unmute your microphone and pause for 2 to 3 seconds before speaking so that your words are captured on the live stream. If you wish to have a document inserted into the record, please ask for unanimous consent and have your staff email the document to veteransaffairs.hearings@mail.house.gov. It will be uploaded to the committee document repository. Without objection, members will be recognized in order of seniority for questioning witnesses today. This will make it easier for me to ensure all members participating have an opportunity to be recognized. Does any member have a question about the procedures for this hearing? Hearing none and seeing none, we will proceed. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. From Oklahoma City in 1994 to Fort Hood in 2009 to Thousand Oaks, California in 2018, and even the assault on our own United States Capitol in January, misguided individuals have committed violence against their fellow citizens in pursuit of distorted objectives. This is a real threat to our nation and to our democracy, and directly impacts the work of our committee, as an alarming number of these individuals have served our country in the armed forces. Today's full committee investigative hearing is entitled Domestic Violent Extremist Groups and the Recruitment of Veterans. FBI Director Christopher Wray has described domestic violent extremism as one of the greatest threats facing our homeland. The corrupting influence of domestic violent extremist groups that recruit veterans is a critical issue at a time where our nation remains deeply divided. We are here today to consider who these domestic extremist groups actually are, what they believe in, and why they specifically target veterans for recruitment. During today's hearing, we will learn about groups whose names have been prominent in the news recently, including the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and the Three Percenters. We will hear about their ideologies, their histories, and seek to understand how these groups view veterans, why they prize veterans and their membership, and actively recruit them. And most importantly, how and when these groups encourage the use of violence to achieve their ends. Our ultimate objective is here, as with all of our work on this committee, is to advance proposals to help and support veterans in need. In this case, that means identifying and developing opportunities to help veterans who find themselves ensnared by one of these domestic violent extremist groups. This effort could include helping them to recognize that they are being recruited, aiding them in exiting these groups, and addressing the pervasive underlying factors that contribute to such recruitment, including critical issues such as mental health, underemployment, and social isolation. We're not here to condemn or vilify veterans engaged with these groups, but rather to draw attention to what these groups actually represent and to highlight the lurking threat posed by these groups, what they believe, and what violent or legal activities they encourage from their members. Can we begin to, only by understanding who these groups are, what they believe, and what violent or illegal activities they encourage from members, can we begin to assess our ability to intervene and to help these veterans and their families reclaim their lives. Today's hearing is intended to be the first in a series of 3 sessions devoted to investigating this issue. This preliminary hearing will focus on identifying and describing the problem, introducing the relevant groups, understanding the landscape of extremism, examining the data trends, and explaining the connection between these groups and veterans. The second hearing to be scheduled in the coming months will focus on the process of recruitment and radicalization into these groups and the contributory factors that make veterans more vulnerable to such efforts. The third and final hearing will address strategies to identify and assist veterans at risk for recruitment by examining the resources available and opportunities for affirmative collaboration between VA, community-based organizations, VSOs, and individuals. Taken together, this series of hearings will give us a comprehensive understanding of domestic violent extremist groups, the levers of recruitment and radicalization, and a range of proactive solutions to address this problem in the veterans community. Before I conclude, I want to take a minute to clarify what exactly this hearing is about, and importantly, what it is not about. We are here today to talk about domestic violent extremist groups. For purpose of definition, we are using the propensity for violence as the key determination of what constitutes extremism. All of these groups that we will be discussing today are ones that have discussed or demonstrated a willingness to use violence as a means to achieve their ends. We are not defining extremism as any particular political ideology or viewpoint. And indeed, violent extremism exists on both ends of the political spectrum. We are specifically using the propensity for violence as our definition because it is not our intention to label any political views, parties, or opinions as inherently extremist, but rather to recognize that any viewpoint, when expressed through violence, crosses a dangerous line into extremism. Violent conduct is outside the scope of constitutionally protected speech and beyond the limits of the law. Violence should be rejected by all of us, irrespective of party or politics, and like the vast majority of issues that come before this committee, it should be a bipartisan concern. I trust with that in mind that we can engage in a thoughtful discussion today. Ranking Member Bost, I now recognize you for 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to say welcome to our witnesses. And you know, we are here today to discuss violent extremists among veterans. The important word there is violent. Something that seems extreme in Southern California might be commonplace in other parts of the country. That doesn't make it wrong. The First Amendment gives us the freedom to hold and express beliefs and opinions, regardless of how extreme other people might think that they are. And I thank God for that we live in a country that we have that. Free speech is a foundation to democracy and the American way of life. The way service members and veterans have fought and died over the last 245 years for this free speech must be protected. You know, I will oppose any efforts to restrict it. It is every veteran's right to have an opinion, even one I find radical. However, if that opinion is acted on with violence, it is another thing altogether. Violence cannot be tolerated. It is an undemocratic and anti-American. And we have seen political violence from across the political spectrum over the last several years. For example, there were devastating riots in several major American cities last year. Those riots did incredible damage to people and property. And they led to the calls to defund the police and led to rising crime throughout the country. There was also the riot on the Capitol on January 6th. When the chairman announced his investigation into the targeting of veterans by violent extremists, I was concerned that it was a political exercise seeking to capitalize on January 6th. This hearing was originally scheduled for July 29th. However, on July 23rd, my staff and I learned on Twitter from a reporter that the hearing had been postponed. The postponement was allegedly due to scheduling issues. However, my staff was later told by the chairman's staff that the hearing was actually been postponed at the request of Speaker Pelosi. Allegedly, she was concerned that our hearing would interfere with the first hearing of the Select Committee on January 6th on July 27th. And I'm sure that members understand my serious frustration with those events. First, it is unacceptable that the important information about our schedule would be shared with the members of the media before me, my staff, or other committee members. Second, I was already concerned that this investigation was motivated by partisan politics rather than the best interest of the veterans. Speaker Pelosi's order to postpone the hearing because of its overlap with the Select Committee on January 6th confirmed my concerns. Let me be clear, the VA committee is not the appropriate place to debate that incident. There are other House committees with that jurisdiction and expertise just to do that. There is also the Select Committee on January 6th. I have serious concerns with partisan nature and narrow focus of the Select Committee, but our job on the VA committee is to honor, support, serve, and empower veterans. Our job is to help them get care, benefits, services, and opportunities that they've earned. If anything is going to prevent veterans from falling prey to violent extremism, it is that. There are approximately 18 million veterans in this country. They come from every background and belief system. Veterans are hardworking, highly skilled, and well-respected. Those qualities make veterans excellent employees, leaders, and community members. Those qualities may also make them attractive to violent extremism who want to take advantage of their skills and standing to cause violence and division. It grabs at the headlines when veterans are accused of becoming violent extremists. But there is very little data on how many veterans are actually involved in violent extremism and the actions that follow. And there is no question that the vast majority of veterans are law-abiding, peaceful. We cannot let a few bad apples spoil the whole bunch. There is already a false but persistent narrative about veterans. It says that they're sick, broken, dangerous, so-called a ticking time bomb. What is actually dangerous is that stigma. And I am concerned that this hearing will spread it. That stigma makes it harder for veterans to find jobs and to seek help if they need it. Most importantly, it is also false. We know that a lot of violent extremism takes root online. That is one of the reasons why Congresswoman Mace and I introduced H.R. 2326, the Veterans Cyber Risk Awareness Act. Our bill would require a study about cyber risk facing veterans from fraud, disinformation campaigns, and yes, violent extremists. It would also require VA to partner with other agencies and experts to share best practices with veterans about how to stay safe online. And I hope we will be able to consider in the committee and on the House floor this legislation soon. And then I hope that we can get back to doing what we do best for veterans and leave the partisan politics investigations in the past. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Now let me introduce our esteemed witnesses. Our first panel features a mix of established veteran voices and experts on the data and dynamics of extremism. We'll hear first from Lieutenant Colonel Joe Plensler, a retired Marine who has been outspoken on the issue of veterans and extremist groups. Mr. Jeremy Butler, the CEO of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. Dr. Seth Jones, Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And Dr. Cynthia Miller Idris, the Director of the Polarization and Extremism Research Innovation Lab at American University and author of Hate in the Homeland. Thank you for being here, and I remind our witnesses to pause for 2 to 3 witnesses before speaking and answering questions. Colonel Plensler, you are recognized for 5 minutes to present testimony.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Bost, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Joe Plensler, retired Marine Corps officer and combat veteran of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I speak here today as a concerned American on the threat posed by domestic violent extremist groups and their efforts to recruit and organize veterans for the purpose of inciting violence and overthrowing our republic. This issue should concern us all who have sworn an oath to support and defend the Constitution, irrespective of political party or ideology. While January 6 highlighted the issue of violent domestic extremism, many of us have been following this issue for many years. I first started tracking such groups and trends on April 7, 1990, when I joined a group of others to disrupt a march held by members of the Ku Klux Klan and Nazi skinheads. While in uniform and as a graduate student, I studied the tactics violent extremist groups use to recruit members and incite them to violence. Violent extremism is a growing problem in America and by extension the military and veteran communities. The question is not whether domestic violent extremist groups are recruiting and organizing veterans to commit violence. We already know this to be true. The questions are, how extensive is this problem and what are we going to do about it? Here's what we do know. First, the threat is real and we are all at risk, especially those who carry out the duties and responsibilities of government. For decades, violent extremist groups have sought to infiltrate our military to gain tactical training and access to weapons and explosives. They have also recruited veterans because of their military skills, leadership, and ability to organize. They specifically target the isolated, the impoverished veterans who are frustrated and confused, those who are struggling to adapt to the civilian world. They provide them with a tribe, a simplistic view of the world and its problems, actionable solutions, and a sense of purpose. And then they feed these vulnerable individuals a concoction of lies and an unrelenting narrative of political and social grievance. And they've been successful. Security experts are increasingly concerned about the rising participation of law enforcement members, active duty and reserve service members, and veterans within the ranks of these violent extremist groups. Veterans have been connected in 10% of all domestic and terrorist attacks since 2015. This is shocking since veterans only comprise less than 6% of the population. While veterans who participate in domestic terrorism may be few, they can be extremely dangerous. For instance, it only took one by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald, a Marine veteran, to stun a nation and change the history of the presidency. It only took two Army veterans by the names of Timothy Mcveigh and Terry Nichols to destroy the federal building in Oklahoma City and kill 168 people and wound hundreds more. And just this past January, an insurrectionist mob, engaging in seditious conspiracy and led in part by violent extremist groups, invaded this house and despoiled the very altar of our democratic republic. They breached the security of this building and hunted. They hunted for you. Of the more than 620 arrested as of September 29th, 71 had ties to the military and veteran communities, representing 12% of the mob. 5 were either active duty members of the Guard and Reserve. 66 were veterans. Investigators have linked 77 of those arrested to violent extremist groups. And I'm disgusted to say more than 20 of those arrested served in my Marine Corps. They dishonored themselves and their families in the illustrious legacy of our Corps. So what can we do? First, we must better understand the problem. I commend this committee in launching an investigation into this issue, and I applaud the work of our leading think tanks and universities. I urge greater coordination with the FBI and Department of Homeland Security. Second, the VSOs must raise awareness of this threat. There are 48 congressionally chartered VSOs and 14 other veteran and military associations affiliated with this committee. The leaders of these 62 national organizations should be strongly encouraged to speak out about this growing threat, reinforce expectations among their members, and proactively work to identify and assist at-risk veterans in their communities. Our nation needs their unequivocal support to help address this threat. Third, we must improve our efforts to prevent veterans from joining these organizations, and I urge the Congress to direct the DoD to modify its TAP program to include a class on the threat of domestic violent extremist groups and their efforts to recruit. This class should also provide FBI recommendations on what to do if approached. The VSOs have a role too, as they had the means to reach out to assist individuals at risk. Members of these VSOs are also respected members of the communities, and as such, they're positioned to execute community-based countering violent extremism strategies. Strong VSOs focused on continued service to our community, state, and nation are one of our greatest weapons in countering and creating protective factors against veteran recruitment by violent extremist groups. Fourth, we must identify veterans who are participating in violent extremist groups and identify them to authorities. The veteran community must police its own. Fifth, we must protect veterans who leave the fold. Fifth, we must protect veterans who leave these organizations and provide them a pathway back into the fold. The testimony you hear today should be a wake-up call for us all. The data is undeniable. Domestic violent extremism is on the rise and is a grave threat to our democratic republic. We have a responsibility to understand how deeply this affects the veteran community and take action now to defeat the cancer of violent extremism in our society. I thank you for your invitation, time, and attention, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Colonel Plensler. Without objection, your written testimony in full will be included in the hearing record. Mr. Butler, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Boston, distinguished members of the committee, on behalf of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America and our more than 425,000 members, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to testify for today's hearing on the important topic of extremism within the veteran community. I applaud the committee for holding this hearing, and I look forward to an honest assessment of the situation within the country. I do believe that extremism exists within the military and the veteran space, not because it is a rampant problem, but because it exists within the broader American population. Whatever group, race, belief, religion, or viewpoint exists within American society, you will find it within the military and by extension within the veteran community. I believe that that is actually one of the strengths of our military and why it remains one of the most respected institutions of government, because its makeup reflects the society it serves. But not every view is one that should be tolerated, and extremist thoughts, especially those that condone or advocate for extrajudicial violence, should not be tolerated or allowed to spread unchecked. I do not believe that extremist views are pervasive within the veteran space. Quite the opposite. I know that most veterans abhor extremist views and actually want to continue their service to the country after they have hung up the uniform. However, because extremist views are not pervasive does not mean that they should not be taken as a serious threat or that those who hold them are not detrimental to good order and discipline or to the overall strength of the institutions in which they are found. Whether you believe that they are elements of extremist views within the community, or if you have questions about their existence, it should be a priority for you to investigate and understand whether or not and to what extent they do exist. A presence at any level degrades confidence in government, lends credibility to any extremist organization that claims members of the military and veteran community, and paints an inaccurately negative picture of the greater veteran community when we already have a large and widening civil-military divide where most Americans do not know or understand the veteran experience. For me, this is about maintaining trust and confidence in our military and by extension, our veteran community. For decades, public trust and confidence in our community has been high, but that is slipping. There are many reasons why, but the over-politicization of every personal action is partly to blame. I'm here to encourage you to see this not through the lens of party, but through the lens of democracy. My focus, and hopefully yours, is not a condemnation of a political party or ideology, but to improve and strengthen our government institutions, safeguard democracy, and uphold civil rights for all. We accomplish this by being honest about both our success and our shortcomings, and then working collaboratively to fix those shortcomings. Denying that deficiencies have and continue to exist within our country does not build confidence, and it does not keep with the oath that we have all taken. If veterans are in fact being targeted and recruited by extremist groups, then it's very much the duty of this committee to understand why and to address the factors that lead to a veteran feeling open to their messaging. Battling extremism begins with those in charge setting the example. It is what we expect of the military and should be the same for all who swear an oath to the Constitution, which includes members of Congress. It is often forgotten, or perhaps not even realized by most to begin with, but like every member of the military, every member of Congress swears an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Again, like the military, members of Congress affirm that overarching duty lies not to a party, a person, or an ideology, but to the Constitution. I strongly believe that the more often we all, service members and members of Congress, remind ourselves of that oath, the better we will be in carrying out our duties. I'd like to point to recent events that vividly exemplify my point. After 20 years of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, if one of your constituents only listened to the recent hearings conducted by the House Foreign Affairs, the Senate Foreign Relations, and the Armed Services Committees, that citizen would leave convinced that there were only two possible options to explain what had gone wrong: that the U.S. mission failed because of a poorly planned and executed Operation Allies Refuge, or because of former President Trump's February 2020 Doha Agreement. I'll be brutally honest. It was embarrassing to watch those hearings and a disappointment to those of us focusing on righting outstanding wrongs and trying to keep the country from engaging in future debacles. Many members of Congress did not even ask questions to which they wanted answers. It was simple grandstanding. Some did not even let the witnesses speak. Most simply asked questions designed to elicit talking points that showed that everything was the other party's fault. For me, extremism includes putting political party over country, especially if, like those of us in the military, you have taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. If this is what our national leaders are doing, we should not be surprised when their constituency does the same. And the more citizens become polarized, the more it forces politicians to cater to a more extreme base. When citizens feel that the system is not working, they veer towards more extreme leaders to fix the supposed problems. That is the cycle that will end nowhere but in the destruction of the country. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Butler. Without objection, your written testimony in full will be included in the hearing record. Dr. Jones, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Boston, distinguished members of the committee. I think this hearing is extremely important. I just for the record, I've served as a civilian in U.S. Special Operations, so have a particular interest in the findings of the data that I'll present. As this testimony highlights, objective analysis and better data are extremely important to gauge the nature of the threat that we're talking about today and to put together effective responses. As the data in this testimony that I'm going to present highlights, veterans, along with active duty and reservists, have been involved in a growing percentage of domestic terrorist plots and attacks. Some have been involved in extremist activity on digital platforms, including on the cyber end. I should note that this is a very small percentage of veterans, as well as active duty and reservists, but it is a growing percentage. In addition, we've also seen extremist networks attempt to embed their members in the military and actively recruit current as well as retired veterans. They've got valuable skills, as Lieutenant Colonel Plensler noted, small unit tactics, communications, logistics, reconnaissance, and surveillance that have been helpful. I'm going to proceed in 4 steps for the rest of my comments. The first is the data that we have compiled on domestic terrorism focuses on what we call terrorism. And as we've already heard from several members, we focus on the deliberate use or threat of violence by non-state actors to achieve their goals and create a broader psychological impact. Our data set, I think, which includes the universe of cases in the United States by domestic terrorists, starts January 1st, 1994 and goes through January 31st, 2021. We are updating it. And we'll have data that goes through the end of 2021 as well. We have cooperated closely with the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the National Counterterrorism Center, CIA, and the Department of Defense with this data. So I think it's been pretty heavily vetted as well. We move to the second area, just broadly speaking, in terms of trends and incidents and fatalities. In 2020, the number of domestic terrorist attacks and plots, according to our data, increased to its highest levels since at least 1994, though it is important to note that fatalities were fairly low in 2020, the last full year, probably in part because most domestic terrorists from various ideologies have generally not tried to kill as many people as possible, the way historically that Salafi jihadists have in the US, including around September 11th, 2001. We move to veterans, both past and present. I think as we've already heard that we have seen in this country some activity by veterans involved in domestic terrorism over the years. The Vietnam War was one of the historical incidents that contributed to radicalization among disenfranchised veterans. So if we look at the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, a whole range of individuals. We've already heard Timothy McVeigh, but Louis Beam, Randy Dewey, Randy Weaver, William Potter Gale, Richard Butler, Bo Gritz, Frazier, Glenn Miller, and others, including Eric Rudolph, were veterans that committed domestic terrorist plots and attacks and broader extremism in the US. More recently, our data shows that there's been an increase in the percentage of domestic terrorist plots and attacks perpetrated by active duty and reserve personnel, including by veterans as well. So despite the reality that the numbers of veterans committing these plots and attacks are small, the percentage is growing, which is of concern for us. People have mentioned those involved in January 6th, but we've also seen Paul Edward Beller, a US Army veteran, involved in the plot against the Michigan governor. We've seen Brian Lemley, veteran, member of the BASE, white supremacist organization, arrested in the FBI last year, who had served in the US Army and had helped create military-style training for that organization. Our data incidentally also shows growing domestic terrorism targeting the military and law enforcement as well. So not only are we seeing individuals plot attacks, but the military is also a target of those attacks as well. In terms of congressional steps, and very briefly, I do think there's an important need to focus on cyber risk awareness among veterans. I also think there's a more significant need to better understand the scope of the data. We've collected some, but there are a lot of questions and data points that we have not effectively looked into. So with that, I will turn it back and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Without objection, your written testimony in full will be included in the hearing record. Dr. Miller Idris, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Bust, and distinguished members of the committee, I would like to thank you for your service to our country and for calling attention to the critical issue of veterans recruitment to domestic violent extremism. I've been studying this issue for over 20 years, both here and in Germany, where these types of investigations, both into active duty military and veterans communities, are also ongoing. The clearest and most pressing danger from domestic violent extremism in the US comes from white supremacist extremists and anti-government extremism movements and groups. The pace, scope, and scale of these developments have been well documented by the previous testimony and witnesses, and I do so as well in my written testimony. The goals of domestic violent extremists lead to non-democratic ends. They claim inferiority and superiority between groups, undermine democracy globally through extreme actions that include disinformation campaigns, election interference, attacks on freedom of the press, violating the constitutional protections of minority rights, and using violence and terrorism to achieve political goals. These movements overlap and mutually reinforce one another. Two specific trends are elaborated in my written testimony that I won't go into in oral testimony, but happy to discuss. First of all, most extremist content and radicalization today does happen online, which is a difference from previous generations. And second, across the entire domestic extremist spectrum, we're seeing rising accelerationism and calls for revolutionary kinds of civil war, including from groups that position themselves to take advantage of dystopian scenarios related to the breakdown of our existing government and civil society, and also seek to actively instigate this breakdown. I want to spend the remainder of my time talking about the subset of groups and movements that prioritize and value the recruitment of veterans into their ranks. Active duty service members and veterans are targeted because of their tactical skills, communications training, security clearances, and access to munitions, weapons, and facilities, which could be useful to groups in violent action or terrorist plots. They're recruited in part through extremist groups' manipulation of the values that attract many individuals to enlist in the first place, related to defense of the nation or people, brotherhood, courageous heroism, and protection of an oath or the Constitution. In this way, extremist groups and movements seek to convert a sense of betrayal or anger at the government or mainstream society into mobilization to violent action that is framed as heroic defense of the real or true nation. In this sense, valor itself becomes commodified by extremist groups in ways that seek to exploit the experiences and emotions of veterans. This elaboration is not meant to excuse, but rather to explain how acts that should be abhorrent to current and former military service members can be embraced by a small minority of them. It is our duty to provide resources and training to reduce this manipulation and make veterans less vulnerable to recruitment into movements that are actively working to undermine and dismantle the very institutions they have sworn an oath to protect and defend. I'd suggest we need three kinds of investments to prevent veteran radicalization and recruitment into extremist movements. First, veterans need resources to support their reintegration after service through counseling and support for needs that may be contributory causes of vulnerability. Second, veteran support organizations should receive staff training to better recognize warning signs and early red flags of extremist radicalization and to know how to gain access to further help. Finally, the armed forces and veterans communities should invest in preemptive, evidence-based inoculation approaches that intervene before individuals are exposed to dangerous ideas, enabling those individuals to be more resistant to radicalization efforts and disinformation. Inoculation approaches work across ideologies and do not target specific communities or label some people as more at risk than others. Rather, such approaches work to provide blanketed training for everyone, because every individual needs to be equipped with the tools to recognize disinformation, resist propaganda, and defend democracy from extremist threats and the manipulative efforts an extremist fringe will try to use against them. Every U.S. service member who exits the military should be inoculated against the persuasive tactics and manipulative strategies of extremist groups during the separation and transition period when active duty service members are preparing to return to civilian life. The threat posed by the rise in domestic extremist violence is specifically aimed at our democracy itself and should thus be of paramount concern to all citizens, and especially this body. Extremist ideas and groups cannot be left to operate unchecked within the very organizations charged with protecting the population, including its most vulnerable citizens. For the future of multicultural democracy, extremism in the military and the veterans communities must be treated like the threat to national security that it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Idris, without objection, your written testimony in full will be included in the hearing record. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. So my first question is to Colonel Pensler. As chairman of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, my utmost priority is ensuring the safety and well-being of our veterans. While I agree with your concerns about domestic violent extremism and the threat posed to our democracy, how does this issue affect the well-being of veterans?
Thank you, Chairman. You know, I think it's important to remember that we have a responsibility to our veterans who have served and many have risked their lives in combat around the world to defend our freedoms, to help their transition back into the civilian community, which is no small task, right? For a lot of veterans, it's a challenging experience to go from being in uniform in one culture to rejoining the civilian world and find, meaningful occupation, reestablish a sense of community, and build all that on a foundation of meaning. And so I think, when we look at this issue, one of the most corrosive things that comes with violent extremism trying to recruit veterans is they form a cancer within our body, within our community. And they lead a lot of veterans down the wrong path. And I think that's tragic, right? And I ask myself, how do veterans show up at the Capitol on January 6th and invade the building and despoil the very altar of our democratic republic? And, I think to myself, where do we go wrong? Where did the officers, my fellow officers, go wrong in failing to instill values, our core values in these individuals? And ultimately, now these young Americans are going to be, they're going to be charged, right? They're going to be prosecuted. Now their lives are, they're further put behind the 8 ball because of their actions that day. So I think it's tragic. And I think it's, it's really destructive to our community.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that response. Dr. Miller, Idris, the jurisdiction of this committee covers the full range of issues affecting veterans and their lives after they complete their service to our country. Our committee routinely holds hearings on critical issues such as veterans' health care, mental health, suicide prevention, employment, and homelessness. This issue, while very important, is a novel one before this committee. Can you explain to us how we should consider the threat posed to veterans by domestic violent extremism in the context of these other relevant issues?
Thank you for the question. Yes, my view on this is that what we're seeing with veterans is a manipulation of their values, of their interest, of their loyalty to the country by persuasive extremist tactics that deliberately target them for that manipulation. And so, as we just heard from Colonel Plensler, who said, where did we go wrong in failing to instill values? I would say, first of all, nobody went wrong in failing to instill anything, but I think values aren't enough. We also are obligated to teach people about the kind of manipulation that they will encounter or may encounter online. Many people will be naturally immune or resist that, but other people will be vulnerable to it. And it's our obligation, I think, to see part of our duty back to service members is to help equip them with the tools to recognize and resist that propaganda if it comes across their path, that we owe it to them.
Well, thank you, Dr. Miller-Idris. Mr. Butler, I noticed that IAVA has partnered with Syracuse University to conduct your 11th member veterans survey from verified veterans, and that you included some questions about extremism. What are your members telling you in that survey?
Yeah, thank you, sir. They're telling us a lot. So this is the first time we've included this in there. And just for quick context, it's the survey is continuing to be ongoing. It's about 3,500 respondents that we've got so far, and an overwhelming. We asked basically 3 questions that you're referring to. One was, do you think there's a serious problem with extremism in the military, in the post 9/11 veteran community, and have you personally witnessed extremism? And each one of those questions got over a third of the respondents saying that yes, they believe it exists within the military, they believe it exists within the veteran community, and they personally witnessed it. And those were 3 separate questions. So I think it really speaks to the fact that this is truly a problem, that it's not just, those of us testifying here today, but it's the members of our community that are saying this is a problem and something needs to be done about it.
Well, Mr. Butler, I understand that it's an ongoing survey. You haven't fully gotten all the data in, but it is alarming to me that 1/3 of your members, who are our youngest generation of veterans, the post 9/11 or the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, 1/3 of them have noted that they've either witnessed it, they see it as a problem, etc. So thank you for the work your organization is doing. I now want to recognize Ranking Member Boss for 5 minutes. Ranking Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question, Lieutenant Colonel Prenzler, first off, Semper Fi, but I'm going to ask, because it was mentioned in my opening, what impact does the term broken veteran and the narrative in some of our communities do for our veterans' economic prospects and as well as their mental health when they hear that our veterans are broken?
Thank you for the question. I have rarely encountered that in my time outside of the Marine Corps. I left in 2015. I don't deny that it exists in some corners. I know it's been a trope in some Hollywood movies that we've seen. And I think, it has had a contributing factor to preventing veterans from seeking mental health care. But, I'm also very concerned about the reputation of veterans, especially in the light of what took place on January 6th. I mean, in our military as well, since November 2018, the Reagan Foundation found that public trust in the military has slipped by 14 percentage points to today. And also, the Veterans and Citizens Initiative did a poll, and last November till March of this year, we also found public trust in veterans as good role models slip by a similar percentage point of 14 points. So, Ranking Member, my concern is that as long as we maintain an all-volunteer force, the public perception of our veterans and our military remains critical, because we know that veterans' reputations and our recommendations to young people to consider the military as an occupation is almost the number 1 or number 2 factor that recruiters will list as why they join the force. So, while the narrative that you brought up is problematic, I'm very concerned about this issue and about the public perception of our veterans, as you are.
As I am, yes. Mr. Butler, what role does a successful transition to civilian life have for like a newly separated veteran to avoid temptations to join these groups and promote violent and promote violent extremism?
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think that's a huge part of not just this issue, but so many others that veteran service organizations are working on right now. The better job that we can do in supporting our veterans when they transition, I think we're really going to get ahead of many issues, not just extremism, but certainly underemployment, unemployment, educational benefits. So much of what VSOs do, and certainly what IAVA sees when members reach out to us for support, is that if they had come to us sooner, we would have cut off a crisis and really just been able to help them with the transition and with some changes. So I think the more that we can do to connect, maybe not just with veterans, but with active duty service members who are looking forward to when they transition into the veteran community, how we can start helping them earlier. We're going to tackle, I think, a lot of these problems, and I think a lot of them are related. I think if you talk about underemployment, unemployment, lack of a sense of purpose within a veteran, you're talking about the same issues that are also leading towards them being exploited by extremist groups.
So, and then just a real quick follow-up, because then I want to get to another question here, but what do you think we should add to the TAP program to train these veterans and have them be aware?
Yeah, I think a lot of it can be just a greater exposure to what some of these veteran service organizations are doing that can help them with the transition, especially the post 9/11 groups that are so focused on continuing your service as a civilian.
Okay, this is for the whole panel, and I really do want to get to this. This is from whoever wants to answer. The groups have all discussed today all share some level of anti-government beliefs. The RAND Corporation found a heavy-handed attempts for institutions can increase radicalization. So what policies should government implement to address violent anti-government groups without further inflaming their already sentiment and increasing their message instead of, basically fanning the flames? Anyone?
I can jump in on that. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think this is it's also the same problem that we face with conspiracy theories, which is attempts to address them can cause people to dig in their heels even more. It's one of the reasons why I think preemptive education, which teaches everybody about the manipulative tactics of groups and narratives that are out there, is one strategy that government can invest in. Kind of digital and media literacy for everybody, whether we're talking about veterans or fifth graders or 50-year-olds. That is something that is not targeting the ideology itself, but the tactics and the manipulative strategies used by those extremist groups to try to exploit people.
I just think that's something that we should be very aware of. We want to help. We don't want to make it worse. And when you get to many people who get involved with these groups, that's easy to stir, I'm afraid. So with that, my time's ran out, and Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you for your very thoughtful questions, Ranking Member. I now call on Mr. Lamb for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for your participation. First, a question about data, and it kind of follows from something the Ranking Member was asking. There does tend to be this assumption that when veterans do something wrong, especially something radically wrong, like attack the Capitol on January 6th, and we all saw the Marine Corps logo and other logos all over that attack, that decision is somehow rooted in a problem that veterans are having with their transition to civilian life. Does the data actually show us that about the January 6th defendants or people who are similarly committed to groups like the Oath Keepers that call for the overthrow of the United States, or is that still at the hypothesis stage? I know other public reporting has pointed out how many of the January 6th insurrectionists were business owners and people for whom economic opportunity was really not the issue. So I was just curious if we have any answers to that question yet.
I can address part of that question, Mr. Lamb. What we have data that shows there's disproportionate engagement, and we know that there are some conditions that make engagement in extremism a little bit more likely or that there's disproportionate engagement among those who have experienced involuntary exit from the military, for example. That research is there, but we do not have sufficient research. I would say it's a call for additional data transparency, for data collection, and for research really into the actual reasons why veterans are engaging in those movements. What we know is that they're attracted in part for some of these narratives, and that the narratives seek to manipulate them. But I think we have had a lack of attention in the research space to that. So that would be something to look into as well.
Absolutely.
Representative Lamb, if I could just add to that, the just broadening this from January 6th for a moment, I think what the data does suggest is for veterans that we are seeing a growing percentage of plots and attacks over the last couple of years involving veterans. What the data does show is that the capabilities that veterans have does present some concern just because of their tactical abilities, their communication capabilities, small unit tactics, that those kind of capabilities do present a risk. But there are a lot of questions that we don't necessarily know yet that I would just say, as we're looking for solutions to this problem, I think we need to answer a couple of questions before we really can understand what kind of solutions we need to help veterans. And this is, I think, where we have to go.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's kind of why I was asking. I don't know yet if the answer is sort of programmatic in the way that we would think about other veterans issues. It could also be that in the last couple of years, something else happened that never happened in American history, which is that, troops for the first time had a commander in chief who condoned and even called for and incited a violent insurrection on his own country. And so that's bound to have some effect on the people who, are under his command, which they were on the day of January 6th. So I do think it could be different in terms of what the true cause is. Regardless, someone, I think it was Jeremy, used the phrase that we need to police our own. And I agree with that. And I'm just curious how anyone on the panel, maybe starting with Jeremy, because I haven't heard from you yet, would view a sort of campaign or class that would feature some of the people who pled guilty from January 6th that are veterans, talking about how misguided they were and their mistakes. Some of them are bound to come to that realization, probably not all, but in any case of this nature, there will be people who regret what they did and regret their betrayal of the oath that they thought they were protecting. It strikes me that sort of peer-to-peer voice is probably more important than the voice of experts. But Jeremy, or maybe Lieutenant Colonel Plensler, if you could address that, please.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say, I think any campaign that would probably be more effective if it took place as more of a peer-to-peer thing than a PSA type of event, because I think that's where the message is going to be much better received than from more of a top-down part. And I'll stop because I think Joe's got a comment as well.
No, thank you, and thanks for the question. More than about 1/3 of our veterans formally belong to a veteran service organization. And I think one strategy I would try to employ is to have the FBI or Department of Homeland Security brief the leaders of our veteran service organizations on this threat so that they become more knowledgeable about what's going on. I would ask them in this committee to ask these leaders to raise these issues with their members, throughout their command structure within their organizations in all 50 states. I would also ask them to reinforce the values of the organization and how these veteran organizations were brought up to withstand the threat of things like communism after World War I, right? And then paint the behavior as a deviant behavior. Say, hey, this is absolutely wrong. Like, veterans should have never shown up. They shouldn't be part of these organizations. Paint that as a deviant behavior, and then paint your membership as a solution to that problem. And I think lastly, provide them things to do. What do you do when you recognize a veteran who might be slipping into this kind of ideology? How do you fish them out of that and put them on a better track? So I think, those 5 steps are what I'd take a look at doing.
Thank you all. I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamb. Mr. Banks, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I hope every veteran in America is watching this hearing today and hearing from you and the majority party in control of this committee that our veterans are so stupid and susceptible to becoming domestic terrorists that you and the Democrats have to save them from it. It's wildly offensive and dangerous. I wish we were talking about a lot of other issues like the rise in veteran suicide and other issues affecting our veterans, but here we go again. On June 21st, 2020, President Biden released his national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. This strategy rightfully calls out domestic violent terrorists animated by racist values and those who seek to intimidate individuals using the threat of violence. What this strategy doesn't do, however, is name any one of the violent leftist extremist groups who terrorized our cities last summer. Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and other political organizations caused up to $2 billion in damage across the nation and have had little pushback from this current administration. Mr. Butler, according to President Biden's definition of extremism, even the chairman's own definition of a propensity for violence, should Antifa and Black Lives Matter be included in the White House's definition of domestic extremism?
Thanks for the question, sir. I think this is kind of going back to the comments that I was making in my opening statement, which I feel like we are trying to score political points over focusing on the issue at hand. And I appreciate your question, but I'm not going to specifically answer it because I don't think it's helpful. I think what we need to focus on are the issues that our veterans are identifying and that we're identifying that need to be addressed.
Mr. Butler, are you aware of any steps that the White House is taking to address far left extremism?
I don't work at the White House. I run Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, so my focus is on our members, our constituents, and veterans throughout the country.
Got it. Dr. Cynthia Miller Idris, you have presented numerous concerning statements that may lead people to question your credibility. In an 8-tweet Twitter thread on August 13, you stated, quote, meat eating is used to evoke both pro-American and anti-government sentiments all at once. And quote, red meat consumption is championed by the far right as a celebration of manliness. You've also stated that, quote, far-right podcasters have claimed that veggie burgers are part of a Jewish capitalist plot against white people in industrialized society. In another tweet, you stated that, quote, far-right soup kitchens put pork and lentil in their soup to exclude Muslims and Jews. Dr. Miller Idris, I had hamburger last night. Do you believe that I am an extremist? Does eating red meat make someone an extremist?
Of course not. Eating red meat does not make someone an extremist any more than being a service member or a veteran makes someone an extremist. We're talking about complete fringe set of phenomenons here.
Do you think that you're able to provide impartial testimony to a committee that's mostly made up of red meat, of meat eating members, like many on this committee?
Yes, thank you for the question. Although it's a distraction, I think, from the purpose of this hearing. I'm a red meat eater myself. So, you know, I fully appreciate that question. I think it is absurd. It's a part of my book that points to the absurdity of the kinds of manipulative tactics that some of these extremist movements use. But the point of today's hearing is to talk about the vulnerability of veterans and not to talk about my tweets from last summer about parts of my book that analyze data.
You did tweet all of those wacky things. And let me say this, rhetoric like the kind that Dr. Miller Idris spouts is dangerous. When supposed academics portray normal, everyday behavior as problematic, it vilifies an entire community of peaceful people. And this leads to policies like we currently see in the FBI, who are now investigating parents as extremists for opposing critical race theory. So, Mr. Butler, what effects do you think that this type of rhetoric has on our veterans?
To be honest, I think the types of questions that you're asking are what are part of the problem here. And that's what I was trying to address when I was referencing back to the hearings about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. All of the questions, well, maybe not all, 99% of the questions were about scoring political points and not about addressing the issue at hand or even the larger issues that need to be addressed. And frankly, sir, that is the problem. We're using lies, we're using obfuscation, misinformation to avoid addressing the real issues that this country is facing.
Mr. Chairman, I think this hearing is offensive, and the fact that you're going to save our veterans from becoming political terrorists is offensive to every veteran in America. I yield back.
Mr. Banks, thank you for your questioning. Our focus today is on violence, and I condemn violence wherever it comes from, whether it's the left or the right. Today's testimony underscores the use of violence and the specific recruitment of veterans is particularly relevant with regard to far-right groups such as the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. I do now want to recognize Mr. Mcveigh for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Takano, and thank you for all the members and all our witnesses. Last week, I was proud to chair the Subcommittee on Technology Modernization's first legislative hearing, which included an extensive discussion of VA's data collection efforts. The hearing reinforced the importance of good data in delivering better care to our veterans. Indeed, if we can't measure it, we can't fix it. With that in mind, Dr. Jones, in your written testimony, you suggested that the U.S. military is not doing enough to understand the pervasiveness of extremism within its ranks. Could you elaborate on what types of data the military should be collecting regarding evidence-based indicators of violent extremism?
Yes, thank you for the question, Representative. And again, as our data suggests, we're talking about tiny percentages of active duty reservists and veterans. Still, the increase in percentages of those involved in plots and attacks has risen, so it's worth looking closely at it. I think what we're pushing for on data is for those involved in plots and attacks, How and why were they radicalized? What were the methods, if they were recruited, for recruiting them? And how do you put those answers together to give us a sense for how to counter them? So in other words, if they were radicalized, how much was it health-related reasons? How much was it for economic reasons? We've gone down this road, Representative, for those that are radicalized as violent jihadists inspired by the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. And I think there's similar questions we need to ask is what's the radicalization path like for those, again, we're talking about violence, not those with various political beliefs, but for those who migrate to violence, why are they doing it? And how are they being recruited if that's how they're doing it? I would also add that we're also seeing some activity from states, including the Russians, in this area. So I think it's worth looking at how some foreign actors are involved in this. And then based on answers to that, I think then we can craft a better solutions to dealing with it. The way, frankly, we have with sexual assaults, PTSDs, suicides in the military. Thanks.
So Mr. Jones, my next question would be, how would it be shared among different government agencies, including the VA?
Well, I think the once the data is collected, I think then the discussion within the Department of Defense and the VA is how do we craft programs together based on what the analysis indicates on radicalization? How do we then craft solutions? Because this is where we have to come to at the end of the day is how do we better support our veterans? Is it identification of radicalization? Is it bringing families in to support them? But I think crafting of policies is going to depend on answers, and the VA is going to be a really important part of the solution.
And then finally, how would such data facilitate rehabilitation and other interventions that reduces veteran susceptibility to violent extremism?
Well, I think what you could do over time is track whether these programs are actually having an effect. I think at the end of the day, what I'd like to see is a decline in these percentages of those involved in plots and attacks. So if the programs we're putting together for veterans to help, again, much like we've seen with other challenges that veterans have had, if we start to see a decline in those numbers, we know that there is a likelihood of having an effect. If we don't, we're seeing still high numbers. We've got to rethink the kinds of programs that we're providing them.
I thank you, Dr. Jones. At this time, Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mcveigh. I now call on Ms. Mace for 5 minutes.
Okay, there I am. I had to unmute myself. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate everyone who's with us this morning on this. I believe it's a very important issue. Domestic terrorism, from domestic and foreign terrorism, is an important issue, no matter whether you're a veteran or not. And I think also having information and data to have this hearing is equally important in my understanding, as we really don't have much data to go from on this hearing. In terms of the number of vets who were arrested on January 6th, I've seen figures in testimony from 40 to 70, very wide swing there. It's no secret that there are criminals looking to prey on unsuspecting internet users, including our veterans. Nowadays, it seems everyone is at risk of disinformation, of identity theft, scam, and fraud spread on the internet and social media. But despite all of these well-known threats, there are many individuals who are not armed with the proper knowledge to make informed decisions about what they are consuming, clicking, and liking and reading online. That's why Ranking Member Bost and I introduced HR 2326, the Veterans Cyber Risk Awareness Act. This bill would direct the VA in coordination with other experts to create an outreach campaign to educate veterans about cyber risks. Today's hearing has made it clear that we do lack crucial data and information to determine whether veterans are actually more vulnerable or less vulnerable than others, civilians, and how many veterans are actually participating in violent extremist groups. We lack all of this information, a lot of this information and data. This lack of data is why our legislation would require an independent study on veterans' vulnerability to cyber risks, resources to assist vets in combating cyber risks, and the effectiveness of this type of outreach campaign. This bill is supported by the Disabled American Veterans, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Student Veterans of America, Paralyzed Veterans of America, and the Wounded Warrior Project. And just last week, Mr. Mcveigh allowed me to speak on this bill, and I appreciate that opportunity. I hope that the overwhelming support we're receiving will lead to the bill's inclusion in our next full committee markup. It's very clear to me today that we lack data on this issue. So I have a couple of questions in the remaining time that I have. My first one is for Mr. Butler. Despite the widespread support of the VSO community, IAVA has yet to support this bill. So I'd like to ask you if you support HR 2326.
Thank you, ma'am. I look forward to hearing more about it from your office. I'm sure my leadership in DC is probably connected to your office on this. I don't know enough about it right now to tell you, but I definitely can assure you that we will check out the merits of it and give you a thumbs up or thumbs down. And if it is a thumbs down, we'll tell you exactly why. So I look forward to hearing more about it.
Yeah, I would love that. We need as much support as we can get. And I think, seeing that there is such a lack of data, and Dr. Jones, I appreciate you being here today. And I know in your testimony, your comments that you're going to present data to us, but to my knowledge, I heard a lot of anecdotes, but I did not hear a lot of data. And to make informed decisions about policy, I do think it's really important to have data to go from. And my understanding, I think your testimony said there were 66 vets that were arrested on January 6th. Is that what your data kind of said?
Our data looks at the number of plots and attacks. So there are a number of indications that there were roughly 66, but yes, that's correct.
Okay. And you said in your testimony that although the number of veterans that are involved in domestic terrorism type of attacks or violent attacks, the number is low, but the percentage has gone up. Have you compared that percentage to the cases of violent acts by groups like Black Lives Matter, Antifa, anti-fascists, fascists? What is the difference? Have attacks by those individuals also gone up at the same rate as veterans or gone up at a higher rate?
Well, again, what we see between 2015 and 2020 is that 10% of all domestic terrorist attacks and plots were committed by veterans. I mean, there's various time that has
What
gone by. What
percentage of violent attacks and domestic terrorism attacks are been committed in the last 2 years by Antifa or Black Lives Matter?
What we found in 2020, for example, is that anarchists, anti-fascists, violent environmentalists, and others perpetrated 23% of terrorist attacks and plots. Yes.
Okay. Did you know that
those numbers have gone up as well?
Yeah. And I heard you understand you work with the FBI, the DHS, and DOD. Did you know the FBI doesn't even track Antifa cases? And there have been hundreds of acts of violence and domestic terrorism across the country, not just on January 6th, but over the last year and a half, including at my home in Charleston, South Carolina. So I appreciate all of your time today, and I hope that we can get more data to make good, better, more well-informed decisions to help our veterans in the future. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Mace. I now call on Mr. Brown for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the hearing. Let me just start by saying that veterans and the veterans community are overwhelmingly characterized as honorable men and women who courageously served our country, and rightfully so. Many continue to serve our country and communities throughout our nation after taking off their military uniform. But the post-service experience of our individual veterans is neither identical nor successful among all veterans. Most veterans who leave military service are successful in many ways. Some leave military service and encounter setbacks after setbacks for a variety of reasons. This isn't my opinion, but rather evidenced by the fact, for example, that veterans experience higher rates of homelessness and suicide compared to the general population. And this committee, on a bipartisan basis, has sought to address both homelessness and suicide among veterans. But likewise, our veterans are targeted at higher rates by extremist groups for recruitment into these violent organizations. This, Mr. Chairman, is evidenced, as mentioned by many of our presenters today, by the high rate of participation by veterans in the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol. Even surveys conducted by the Military Times, reports published by the DOD, and even the Army Criminal Investigation Division have all documented the rising levels of recruitment and participation of military members in extremist groups. So it's my hope that this committee, on a bipartisan basis, will likewise care for our veterans and ensure our domestic security by protecting our veterans from being targeted by these violent extremist groups, whoever they are. First question, Dr. Miller, Idris, in your view, and I believe this is kind of a follow-up to Representative Lamb's question, when are service members, transitioning service members, and our veterans most vulnerable to recruitment by extremist organizations?
Well, thank you for the question, Representative Brown. We part of the lack of data that we were just hearing about is that we don't really know precisely when they are most vulnerable. We do know that one of the moments of vulnerability is after separation from the military, particularly for a small minority of service members and veterans who may lack a sense of belonging or have lost their sense of purpose that was so appealing to them before. And then there's these persuasive tactics from extremist groups seeking to manipulate them and recruit them in because they're so attractive based on their prior history. So there's no particular time point that we know of because of the lack of studies and data that I hope will be remedied eventually. But certainly after the time of separation, if there's not a successful transition into finding a better sense of purpose again and meaning and the kind of enacting of their sense of purpose, that is a time when they are particularly vulnerable.
Thank you. And that's why I offered an amendment to the fiscal year 22 NDAA that would address extremism, not only in the armed forces, but also to strengthen the transition assistance program to defend against recruitment by extremist groups. I'd like to ask Mr. Butler and Colonel Plensler, you mentioned both, actually all of our presenters have mentioned this program, TAPS, in your testimony. How else can the transition assistance program be strengthened to help transitioning service members be prepared against the threat of extremist groups, recruitment by those groups?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say, I think the more that we can add to the TAPS program to make it more effective in providing transitioning service members with information and guidance on jobs, education, housing, healthcare, all of these issues that tend to build and become much larger issues down the line, the more we can set them up for a path to success right out of the gate, I think the better off we're going to be in combating some of these other issues, such as invitations to extremism, as well as mental health problems down the line. I think the TAP program is one of those areas where we have to continue to iterate and continue to improve.
Colonel Plensler?
I would totally agree. I think working to the left of this issue in a preventative measure is the best way to go. And I think if we can stop people from even considering joining these groups, that's where we can apply the greatest pressure. Because once somebody joins and their values are set, it's really difficult to recruit them away. And it usually takes somebody who's left one of those organizations to go back and help those veterans navigate their way out and become extracted from it. So yeah, definitely working on the left of the recruitment side of it, and but letting veterans know, hey, they're out there. They could try to recruit you, and this is what to do if you're approached. Report it to the FBI. I think are some important messages that all service members need to know.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Brown, for your questioning. Mr. Rosenau, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. The First Amendment to the Constitution protects American citizens' right to free speech, to peaceably assemble to petition the government for redress, and of association, which has been upheld by courts for many, many years. This is a critical right that generations of American service members have fought and died for. Obviously, this protection ends when an individual's actions become violent, and I strongly condemn political violence of any kind. However, we cannot criminalize free speech, and we cannot criminalize the thoughts or beliefs of individuals simply because they may be viewed as different from our own. It doesn't matter what they believe, or what political party they belong to or associate with. I am deeply concerned this will have a chilling effect of silencing veterans from engaging in political speech, in effect depriving them of the very rights that they fought to defend. Sadly, this is not the only concerning example of those on the left trying to use government institutions to intimidate individuals they disagree with into silence under the guise of them being violent extremists. We saw just last week the Department of Justice weaponized against concerned parents who take the time to voice their concerns at school board meetings. These are hardly the only examples. I also have grave concerns regarding today's investigative hearing. Our veterans are hardworking and high-skilled individuals and leaders in our communities who have made incredible sacrifices to protect each and every one of our freedoms. It is an unfortunate reality that veterans have long battled stigmas associated with mental health issues resulting from their service, as well as perceptions they have a propensity to violence. I am deeply concerned that today's hearing in the Veterans Affairs Committee, rather than empowering our veterans by dispelling these stigmas, will further perpetuate these stigmas for all veterans and to be at the expense of veterans across our nation. The purpose of the House Veterans Affairs Committee is to support veterans through providing timely access to high quality health care and benefits which they have earned. I'm confident that by actually fulfilling this mission, instead of partaking in politically motivated investigations or instituting ideological tests, we will empower veterans to live healthy, successful, fulfilling lives. That being said, I'm deeply disturbed by the riots that occurred at cities across our nation last year and believe we must acknowledge the billions of dollars of damages and multiple deaths that occurred. To anyone on this panel, why is it today at the violent domestic extremist groups and recruitment of veterans are groups like Antifa and BLM notably absent?
Well, I can answer that. Thank you for your question and your comments. I believe the focus of this hearing is on the threats that are deemed the greatest risk to our Homeland Security. And as the Department of Homeland Security indicated in October 2020 in their annual threat assessment, and as the Office of the Director of National Intelligence indicated in their threat assessment in March of 2021.
You don't believe that billions of dollars of damage across our nation last summer is a threat to our national security?
Every form of political violence is a threat to our national security, but there are data points that indicate what the greatest threat are that have been assessed by the Department of Homeland Security and by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence under two different administrations.
And billions of dollars of damage across our nation, again, is not a threat?
Of course it's a threat. I said it's a threat, but
so
the
why are these groups not
is not equal to the threat.
Why are these groups then not included in this assessment that's taking place today?
That would be a question for the staffers, I think, to answer.
Okay, I'll be moving on then. Thank you. It's been estimated that the riots of 2020 cost Americans and property owners $1 billion and possibly up to $2 billion in damages. Colonel Plesler, what impact do such violent actions by those on the extreme left have on business owners, some of which are veterans, many of these business owners who are unable to easily offset these costs?
Thanks for your question, and I think it's an important one. I think anytime anyone in our country commits political violence, is a threat to all of us. So I don't think we should, take great pains to differentiate between where that violence is committed, except when it's committed against symbols of our democracy. I think it's one thing, and it's tragic when somebody burns down a Walmart. I think it's another thing when they show up in our nation's capital and attack the very symbol of our democracy. And I'd like to
read like the Antifa and BLM folks did again last summer when they were painting on statues and destroying private property here in the city as well.
What I'm saying is that our nation's capital.
Do you believe that was violent acts that justified investigation?
I think it's interesting to make a distinction between that and showing up at our capital, which is really the cathedral of our body politic, right? I think there's two.
They're just on the street, one block detached from the Capitol, and they're destroying private property. Then that's not considered as severe as someone who actually came into the Capitol and in many circumstances had no barriers in place because the security was so lax that they could just waltz in.
I see one as an attack on commerce. I see another one as an attack on our Constitution.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I see my time has expired. I would yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale, for your questioning. I now call on Ms. Capter for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much, and also Ranking Member Bost and all of our very distinguished guests. I'm sorry to be late to join you. I didn't hear some of the full presentations because we couldn't get in, but we finally figured it out. So what's been running through my mind is recent history of our country over the last half century and the very complicated conflicts in which we've asked our young men and women to serve. If I think back to when I was first coming of age, the war in Vietnam, which to this day, our country has been very reluctant to investigate, to explore, to be honest about what happened in that conflict. I won't go into all of it. I have a dear veteran friend who's dying right now. He was in one of the early battles in '65, La Drang, and at Landing Zone Albany. And just to read the history, to go back and reflect on that. For those of you who lived through it, you know that we lost the draft, right? So now we have a volunteer military. It crippled a tradition of service to our country. And now with the Gulf Wars, I think to Timothy Mcveigh and the Oklahoma City bombing and some of the materials that were found in his car and fighting in a conflict that obviously when he came home, I'm not making excuses for him in any way, but he acted out in an extremely violent way. I don't know if we'd had better care in our veterans facilities. We're short now for all of the mental health issues that vets are coming home with. Maybe we didn't do our job back in the 90s as a country. And then today now with Afghanistan, we are going to face similar issues with returning vets whose service must be respected in a very complex environment. So I think this last half century has really been a coming to terms of America with her foreign engagements. And I don't think that the country, and I'm not placing the blame on any person or any agency or any political party, I think that the public is unresolved about some of these situations and what they actually fought for and fought against. So I think we have a very large responsibility, goes beyond the mandate of this committee, but this committee could make a contribution to that. I just think this is it's a very atypical period of the United States, maybe America's coming of age in terms of understanding its role in the world. We're still the youngest democracy on earth, youngest republic on earth. So I suppose we can reflect on some of this history now and think how we can make it better. But I'm very concerned about, as we do so with our veterans and welcome them home and honor their service, how do we prepare, how do we better answer their questions about the worth of their service? Nobody can answer that question for me, who's with us today. But I think that is really, is very, very important. And to place the last half century of service in some kind of context, I don't believe we're doing that as a country. And I'm interested in, for veterans, Timothy Mcveigh actually had a Bronze Star. He was in his early 20s in his service. I think we have to go back and study some of that. I think we need to understand it better. And but what didn't exist back then that exists now, and this is my one question, in terms of malign influence by countries like Russia and China, what evidence do we have? I read about Russians involved with the NRA, for example, and funding certain things through the NRA. I want to know if that's true. I want to know about the malign influence operating on social media or through other organizations in our country that are helping to contribute to this radicalization, including among some of our veterans. A very small number, but nonetheless a very serious number of veterans. Who can elaborate a bit on material that might be available that we could read or become familiar with the hastening of radicalism because of malign foreign influence, and by whom?
I mean, just briefly, Representative, my discussions with U.S. intelligence officials in the current and the previous administration do indicate concern about Russian GRU, the Military Intelligence Directorate, as well as SVR, Russian Foreign Intelligence, that are significantly involved in dis and misinformation on digital platforms, particularly trying to spread violent ideologies inside of US platforms, some of which is directed at those that are either serving currently in the US military or are veterans. So happy to have a conversation since I see we're over time. But the GRU and the SVR are the two Russian intelligence organizations I'm most concerned about.
If you could give us any material that we could read, or I would appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, if you could provide those to the committee so we could explore a bit further.
I will request such materials. Thank you, Ms. Capter, for your questioning. Ms. Miller-Meeks, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Takano and Ranking Member Bost. Like others on this hearing, I am very concerned at some of the tenor of what I hear. I'm a 24-year military veteran. My husband is a 30-year military veteran. My brother served in Vietnam. And like Ms. Capter, I believe that their service should be recognized and honored. And Representative Capter, let me also say my prayers are with you and your veteran friend who is suffering at this time. So I'm very concerned with the talk, and I don't recall if it was Colonel Plesher or Dr. Jones who had listed a litany of those individuals or personnel, veterans that they had considered domestic terrorists. It perhaps was Dr. Jones, but did you include in that list Major Nadal Hassan, Dr. Jones, or Colonel Plesher?
Major Hassan is definitely in our data set, obviously inspired by Al-Qaeda's ideology and in contact at that time with Anwar al-Awlaki. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you for that, because even at the 10-year anniversary honoring the 13 who were killed at Fort Hood, and an Army Times article, it still does not reference that as an act of either Islamic terrorism or domestic terrorism. So I found that interesting, and I think that the definition, and I think this has been brought up on, when somebody migrates to violence or what's domestic terrorism, I find it extraordinarily concerning. Memos and testimony from Janet Reno way back as to 1999, talking about veterans, pro-life, pro-gun, Second Amendment individuals as being more susceptible to domestic terrorism. I think recent comments by this administration on people who attend school board meetings and voice their discontent with actions of the educational system as domestic terrorism, and asking for the FBI to investigate those individuals. One can raise their voice and exercise their freedom of speech, freedom to associate, freedom to petition their government, and they are not domestic terrorists. And I'm very concerned about the labeling as such. And so this question, I think, is more for, I apologize for our Iraq and Afghanistan, Mr. Butler, that a recent poll published by Georgetown University found that respondents ranked division in the country, this gets to your point, as the number one issue facing the country's future. Too often pundits speak of division and violence in the same breath. And divisions can and have led to violence, but there are also plenty of different viewpoints that are held by peaceful, law-abiding citizens. And to your point, and I think you were making this reference, how do we protect free speech while also condemning and thwarting violence?
Yeah, thank you, ma'am, for the question. I think the key really is differentiating between upholding free speech and being critical of those that wantonly spread lies, misinformation, and disinformation. It's still technically free speech, but I don't think we as leaders, we as folks that are hopefully many of the country are looking to for facts and truthfulness, should be repeating those or turning to them to make political points. I think there's a difference there, and that's one of the many things that we focus on is we need to get away from using misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies to try and paint a false narrative of what's going on in the country.
Well, sometimes an outright lie is obvious, but other times it depends on who the arbiter is of what's misinformation and disinformation. And I can say that both as a military veteran and as a physician and former director of public health in response to comments I've heard about infection-acquired immunity and for COVID-19. So I think I understand your point, but that leads us down this slope of who is it and what authority is it that then determines what speech is misinformation or disinformation. But I do understand the point you're making. Is it possible, in your experience, that there are similarities and differences in the types of target that violent extremist groups on the left and the right attack? And what can you tell us about the direction of future attacks? And I know my time is limited.
I don't know if that was directed at me as well, but I'm not sure that I'm the best qualified person to answer the question as I understood it.
Dr. Jones?
Yeah, so just to be clear, can you what specifically were you asking? Because the data is pretty broad on this.
My time's expired, so I don't think you have time to answer the question. But thank you, Chairman Chicano. Thank you, Mr. Jones, or Dr. Jones and Mr. Butler, for your responses.
Thank you, Dr. Miller-Meeks. I now recognize Dr. Ruiz for 5 minutes. Dr. Ruiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is an important step in defining the threat of veteran recruitment and radicalization by anti-government extremist organization, the motivation of these groups and why they target veterans, and how we can provide information and resources to help veterans identify these extremist organizations. What is clear is the fact that these extremist groups recruit veterans because they believe their combat experience, weapons training, and leadership skills add credibility and authenticity to their operation. Understanding that these factors are some of the reasons that extremist groups recruit veterans, we also need to investigate why veterans make up at least 25% of militia rosters, a bewildering number indeed. What is it about these anti-government extremist groups with a propensity for violence that entices those who have devoted their lives to protecting and serving our country? What role does social media and misinformation, foreign propaganda play? And to answer these questions, the answers to these questions will allow us to not only prevent our veterans from joining these groups, but also cut off extremist groups' access to combat and weapons trained individuals to further their own violent extremist agendas. Mr. Plensner, as a veteran, you have been outspoken on veterans' involvement in violent extremist groups and have expressed the need for veteran and military family organizations to remove or disassociate themselves from those who participate in violent extremist acts from their groups. Can you describe the threat that these anti-government organizations like the Oath Keepers pose to our communities and our democracies?
Thank you for your question. I mean, simply put, if they have their way, there is no government of the United States anymore.
Can you elaborate? What is it part of their manner, their oath, their core beliefs that makes you say that?
You know, I'm extremely concerned anytime anyone bands together to form extrajudicial armed militias to take on governments at the state or local level. And we've seen similar activity in Michigan recently. That was very disturbing. We've seen similar activity in our nation's capital on January 6th.
And so, how long have they been forming these type of militia organizations? How long have we known that they have this propensity for violence against the government?
Yeah, and I think there's people on the panel who are better qualified, but at least for the last 30, 40 years, we've seen an uptick in those militias.
Okay. And what do you believe why do you believe veterans are drawn to these groups? And do you believe the Oath Keepers and other extremist anti-government groups purposely pursue and recruit veterans?
So let me take the second part of that first. Yes, absolutely they do, right? Because we're really efficient targets for recruitment and also for what we bring to the table. So besides the tactics, techniques, and procedures that we all have studied, especially those of us who have been in ground combat units, that's a very attractive thing for people who want to destabilize our government to seek out. And they also know that veterans are extremely relational and that we are seen as leaders in the community. So if they can get one of us to come along, the chances of getting others to follow are probably pretty good. We do know that they specifically target veterans who are having trouble with their transition, going from the military to the civilian world, right? Because they're particularly vulnerable at that point. And so, I think it's incumbent upon our nation's veteran service organizations, many of them who are out there doing a good job, to try to catch veterans and help them reestablish their feet in the civilian community. But I think we need to keep an extra lookout for those who might be struggling because they are the most vulnerable. And I hope that answered your question.
Yes. And would you describe these organizations and the Oath Keepers as actually being anti-constitutional?
Yeah, and I struggle to find where their beliefs and actions follow the Constitution of the United States. I mean, personally, to see veterans at January 6th insurrection was very, very disturbing for me. I was disgusted to see that any Marines had participated in that event. And when I find out, that, my fellow brothers and sisters of arms, some of who have been, led down the wrong path are joining these organizations, it's very disheartening for me.
And how long do you think this organization, like the Oath Keepers, have been anti-constitutional?
I don't know. That's a hard question for me to ask. And I know there's other witnesses on the panel who could better answer that question.
Okay. Well, I appreciate it. And thank you. I yield back my time.
Thanks for your questions.
That's correct. Thank you, Dr. Ruiz. Mr. Elsie, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to reinforce the fact that the First Amendment protects all American citizens, including veterans' right to free speech and to peaceably assemble. Of course, when anyone's actions degenerate into violence or destruction, those actions are no longer protected by speech and assembly. Constitutional rights and such actions cannot be tolerated. Violent extremism spans the ideological spectrum. Inconsistent and fluid definitions of extremism add to the lack of data of veterans participating in extremist groups and the number of veterans carrying out extremist violence. This lack of clarity adds to the concern this hearing leads to painting veterans with a broad brush that stigmatizes all veterans. I hope this hearing is not a way to undercut the veterans community and by extension our military. A hearing that stigmatizes the entire veteran community is damaging and sets back efforts to provide services to veterans. The veterans that need mental health care already face some unfortunate and unjustifiable stigmatization. There are a lot of areas this committee should focus on to help veterans. The time taken away from that focus is to the detriment of veterans. We should be focused on helping the VA deal with the backlog of care for veterans, benefits delays due to the pandemic, education and economic opportunities, and we should especially be focused on mental health care for veterans. I look forward to working with my committee colleagues on these important veteran needs. And I'd like to point out of the 18 million veterans that are alive in this country today, it was marked that 66 were involved on January 6th. And yet, the entire veteran community is painted with a broad brush, while an investigation is currently ongoing. If you've ever held command in the military, you don't comment on anything until the investigation is complete. And I think it's unfortunate that that has occurred here today. The investigation is not over. The legal rights of those involved have not been addressed appropriately. And until they are, this is an inappropriate comment to make about any veterans, and certainly not painting with a broad brush an entire group of veterans. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Elsie. Representative Underwood, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for holding today's hearing. I'm so pleased that this committee began investigating violent extremism and the recruitment of veterans well before January 6th. And I'm glad that we have an opportunity to hear from this panel of experts today. You know, I've been listening to my colleagues' line of questioning, and I just have to say, I'm really disappointed. You know, in my service on other committees in the Congress, we know that violent extremists pose the greatest terrorist risk to our country. And I am stunned that so many people would rather not know the facts about the recruitment of our nation's veterans to these organizations. It's just pretty shocking. But I had some follow-up questions for Mr. Plensler, if I could. So you said that you find that these groups have some efficiency in recruiting veterans. And I thought that was a really interesting word to use, efficiency. And so I wanted to ask you to expound on that. And then also, do you see veterans groups, so like the VSOs, explicitly calling out like the 3%ers and the Proud Boys and, you know, the Oath Keepers as terrorist organizations to say, like, watch for this? Can you just talk about the kind of forward-facing messages that you are seeing towards veterans?
Yes, ma'am, and thank you for your question. And the comment I made was that veterans are particularly efficient targets for recruitment because of the skills that we have and the abilities that we have. So, you know, I think if you're, you know, a member of an organization that's looking to recruit members and you're looking to do harm to the United States, you know, it's one thing to hang out outside the DMV and recruit any Joe Blow off the street. It's a whole other thing to go after people who actually have training in small unit tactics and weapons and explosives, right? Know how to use them, and the ability to organize and lead other people, and the ability to recruit, because, you know, a lot of our military recruiters are very good. So if you get a hold of a recruiter, you know, they're going to be able to recruit more people to your cause. So, you know, I would like to think that most of my brothers and sisters are pretty resistant to this effort, right? But it's very concerning. The data showing, you know, I would put it this way. The light is blinking red on the dashboard, so we need to look under the hood and investigate this further. And then your second question, could you repeat that for me, please?
Yes. Are you finding that any of the VSOs or other veterans groups, even informally, are doing any proactive messaging towards veterans, explicitly calling out the 3%ers and the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys as, you know, violent extremist terrorist organizations? Yeah. Are you seeing like a message go to veterans saying to kind of beware of this?
Ma'am, I've heard some qualified rejection of the violence of January 6th from some of the nation's VSOs, but that call was not loud enough and not unequivocal enough. And I think one of the reasons is because some of their members have sympathies towards these groups, right? And when you're a membership-based organization and you gain money by collecting dues, some of them are reticent to take a strong stand. And I think that's unfortunate because, you know, if we get to the point where we don't have a republic anymore, then those dues aren't going to matter much at all.
Right. I know that we have a witness here from Mr. Butler. I was just wondering, just because of the position you hold, if you've seen any of your peer groups or your own organization message to veterans explicitly naming out some of these extremist organizations that we know are interested in recruiting veterans.
I'd echo what Joe just said. Certainly, it is challenging. I think we've been very clear. I've tried to certainly be very clear about my thoughts and views. But I think we're also still, in many ways, learning a lot about what these groups stand for and what's going on. I think it's challenging to make any statements like that. I'm not saying that they might not be appropriate at certain times, but I think we do have to take into account that there's still things that we're learning and ways to move forward on this.
And is there an information threshold, you know, so if DOJ classified them in a certain way or something like that, where there would be a more of a comfort level calling them out explicitly as violent extremist organizations that you know, run counter to the values of the organizations, your VSO organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes across the board. I mean, I think ideally we wouldn't have to be in a situation where we'd have to specifically highlight and condemn organizations to stay away from these. But I think to your point, yes, that would probably be a step in that direction to make more folks comfortable doing so.
You know, it's just stunning to me that, you know, the parallels, right? If you look at the global war on terror, you know, Al-Qaeda is clearly a threat. ISIS is clearly a threat. And any other offshoot is clearly a threat. And we wouldn't hesitate to name the threat. The fact that we are having a conversation today with hesitancy about naming the threat of these domestic violent extremist organizations that we know are active in our communities is shocking. And I hope that we can come together to protect our veterans, protect our communities, and protect our country. With that, I yield back.
Hi, thank you, Representative Underwood. Ms. Luria, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Takano, and thank you to our witnesses today. I'd like to first just respond to my colleague, Mr. Elzey's remarks. As Mr. Elzey, I'm a veteran myself. As Mr. Elzey, I'm a graduate of the United States Naval Academy myself, and he referenced those in a broad brush. Anyone who held command in the military would, of course, feel the same way as he does. As someone who's held command in the military myself, I do not share his views, and I would say that I'm glad as a veteran and someone who had the opportunity to serve beside so many others who are now veterans or continue to serve on active duty and will transition, that this committee is really looking at ways that they're susceptible. And, it's shocking to me that any members of this committee would not want to better understand how veterans can be susceptible. Were we talking today about financial crimes and the way that veterans are exploited due to their benefits? Would that be contentious? I think that the fact that we're having this hearing today, does show, in fact, that those members of this committee who find this to be a serious issue do truly value the service of our veterans and want to make sure that we protect them in any way possible. And, I'd also like to say that I was somewhat shocked and aghast by the comments made by Mr. Rosendale. I really appreciate Mr. Butler's testimony. Mr. Butler, who invited you as the witness to this hearing today?
I believe it was Ranking Member Bost who did.
Okay, so you are the Republican witness invited to this hearing today.
Correct.
Yes. I know that you did respond to Mr. Banks' comments, but you were not given the opportunity to respond to Mr. Rosendale's and Mr. Elzey's. Do you have any response to those comments from your perspective and as a representative of a VSO that serves so many veterans in our community?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a lot of issues that, one, need to be addressed, and two, I think we are actually addressing all of the issues that he talked about. I certainly encourage him to reach out to our office. We have a priority as all of these issues that he mentioned, employment, mental health care. It's not as if we can only focus on one issue. There's a wide range of issues that the veteran community have as areas of focus. We certainly hear that from our community, from IAVA members, and we're trying to focus on all of those. And I think that this hearing and focusing on this issue actually reaches across many of them. And so I think it's important that we reach widely in terms of our efforts to address the needs of the veteran community.
Well, thank you, Mr. Butler. And I saw Lieutenant Colonel Plesner nodding. Did you also want to reply?
Yes, ma'am. I agree with Jeremy. We're the United States of America, and we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So it's not like we can either do this or that within taking care of veterans. And this is an important issue. We should never be afraid to seek the truth and take a look at what's going on within our society, and especially within the veteran community. And when I was talking to friends about this issue, I almost equated it to like cancer. You go see your general practitioner. They say, "Hey, we found a lump in your body," and if your general practitioner says, "Oh, hey, don't worry about it," you're not going to not worry about it, right? You're going to rush to an oncologist. You're going to go get some tests. You're going to determine the scope and scale of what this growth might be. And if it is cancerous, you're going to develop a strategy to defeat it. And that's all we're asking this committee to do. And we applaud the efforts of launching this investigation because it is important. It is important to know the scope and scale of these domestic violent extremist groups and their efforts to recruit veterans.
Well, thank you. And in the time remaining, I don't know if Mr. Jones or Dr. Miller-Idris would also like to make any remarks.
And I just to add, Representative Luria, the questions I have are really with the data does show an increase in the percentage of plots and attacks, terrorist plots and attacks in the U.S., domestic ones, involving veterans as well as active duty and reservists. And the question I think we've got to start addressing is why is that the case, and how do we, as Colonel Plensler just noted, how do we start addressing those issues? The same way over the last couple of decades we've identified concerns about PTSD, about sexual assault, about suicides, and about other issues. What's the scale and scope of the problem? What's causing it? And then how do we address solutions to it? Because as someone who's served in Afghanistan, among Somalia and other locations, I think our veterans have every right to the services required to help address the challenges here.
Thank you, Ms. Lurie. I would just add that in the German investigations on this question, when the numbers also were relatively small, but the German defense minister's quote was, "Every case is a scandal." When we're talking about the armed forces, military, or veterans, or our security services, we don't want just proportionate numbers. We want much, much less vulnerability among our veterans, and it's our duty to help them be less susceptible to the propaganda and manipulative efforts. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all of our witnesses. And just in closing, I'll reiterate what my colleague Ms. Underwood said, that, we started investigating this issue, looking into this issue, looking into the vulnerability of our veterans who we care about deeply, long before the events of January 6th. And I think that we can all see that was a very public display of this type of extremism. But I do applaud the chair for his continuing work for the 2 Congresses that I've been on this committee, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Luria. I do not see that we have any further questioning of the present panel, and so I'd like to excuse the panel. Thank you very much for your contribution and participation, your testimony, and your responses. I now would like to welcome our second panel before us. Our second panel features some of the leading experts drawn from the worlds of academia and advocacy on each of the major domestic violent extremist groups. We'll hear from Dr. Sam Jackson from the University at Albany, who wrote the definitive book on the Oath Keepers. Dr. Amy Cooter from Vanderbilt University, who is a leading authority on the militia movement. Dr. Oren Siegel, Vice President of the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism. And Dr. Heidi Byrick, co-founder of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. I want to thank you all for being here, and I remind our witnesses to pause for 2 to 3 seconds before speaking and answering questions. Dr. Jackson, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Sam Jackson. I'm an assistant professor in the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity at the University at Albany. As the chairman mentioned, in September 2020, my book entitled Oath Keepers, Patriotism and the Edge of Violence in a Right-Wing Anti-Government Group was published. In my remarks today, I'd like to provide just a brief introduction to the Oath Keepers organization. This group is part of the broader far-right anti-government movement in the United States that believes that the federal government is the greatest threat faced by everyday Americans. Oath Keepers encourages Americans to prepare for violent conflict with a government seen as tyrannical. More broadly, the group contributes to the perception that violence can be a legitimate tool to achieve political goals. The group's name comes from the very broad idea that current and former members of law enforcement and the military should keep their oath to, among other things, protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. However, Oath Keepers has an abnormal understanding of this oath, what it means to protect and defend the Constitution, and who counts as an enemy. Through its actions and rhetoric, the group encourages its supporters to see conventional political behavior, like certifying an electoral college vote, as action taken by enemies that threatens the Constitution. The group further sets the stage for its supporters to believe that violence is the only recourse to save the Constitution from those perceived enemies. This group has received media attention through the years for a number of different activities, the most prominent of which is certainly the January 6th insurrection. As of last week, 23 members of the organization have been indicted on federal criminal charges related to that day, and 5 of those 23 have pleaded guilty to their charges. But January 6th was not the first time that the group engaged in or prepared for conflict with government. Armed members of Oath Keepers traveled to the Bundy Ranch in Nevada in 2014 to prevent federal officials from carrying out a court order. During their time at the ranch, Oath Keepers contributed to a hostile situation that led the federal agencies to stop their efforts to carry out the court order out of concern for the safety of those on the ground. In 2015, the group offered to provide armed security for a county clerk who had been briefly imprisoned after a federal judge found her in contempt of court. The group publicly offered to send armed volunteers to prevent U.S. Marshals or any other law enforcement officers from taking the clerk into custody should she be found in contempt of court again. One of the most prevalent features of the group's ideas is the perception of threats. In response to these perceived threats, Oath Keepers encourages Americans to prepare for violent conflict. For example, in 2013, the group began an initiative to form armed neighborhood watches modeled on special forces teams. Recognizing that describing these teams as part of preparation for conflict with government might not be well received by many Americans, the group encouraged its members to talk about these teams as security against MS-13 or ISIS, because the action taken to fight against criminals and terrorists could also be used against tyrannical government. As I mentioned, Oath Keepers encourages those with law enforcement or military experience to join the group or adopt its beliefs. In part, the group's emphasis on veterans is a matter of its identity. Important figures within the groups are veterans, and they like to say that their oath to support and defend the Constitution didn't expire when they left the military. They believe that veterans have an obligation to remain active in defense of their understanding of an America that is under threat by the government, by left-leaning Americans, and by a murky group of international elite. This emphasis on veterans is also pragmatic, as we've heard from previous witnesses. Some veterans have skill sets that are useful for those preparing for violence based on experience in combat, emergency medicine, communications, logistics, and intelligence. For example, veterans who served in intelligence units might also have active duty contacts who could be sources of information in a conflict with the government. In closing, I want to emphasize the importance of recognizing that Oath Keepers is part of a broader movement. Even if the organization were to cease today, that would not necessarily change the scale of far-right anti-government extremism in the United States. In the past, some prominent members of the organization have left only to start their own groups that have the same ideas and goals as Oath Keepers. And many individuals in this movement never formally join an organization, despite adopting ideas and rhetoric promoted by specific organizations. Oath Keepers is a concrete example of this broader movement, but we must not let our attention paid to this group cause us to overlook the forest for this one prominent tree. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Ranking Member Bost, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, just a quick question. All the panelists were not given 5 minutes?
Mr. Bost, thank you. I thank you. I now call upon Dr. Cooter for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bost, and other committee members, I don't have the stereotypical background of an academic. I grew up in the foothills of Appalachia, and I've been a gun owner since I was 21. I've used that background to better understand members of the modern militia movement. Rather than studying them only through their online or media presences, I've attended militia trainings and meetings, I've met and talked with their families, and I've extensively talked to them one-on-one. I've learned about their reasons for joining militias and about their beliefs regarding the country, the government, and a host of political and social issues. Through my research, I have found that the majority of militia members are law-abiding citizens. They do not always trust the government, but are not looking for a fight with it either. Given our short time today, however, I'm going to focus on the more extreme piece of the militia movement, on the units that are angrier and that, in my opinion, have a stronger likelihood of violence. Those units tend to have a few things in common. Among them is a propensity to believe in conspiracy theories. Another is strong efforts to recruit veterans. To be clear, I am not saying that all veterans are extremists or potential extremists, or that veterans who join militias only join the extreme factions. Rather, some militias may recruit veterans for both symbolic and practical reasons. Militia groups with many veterans can make symbolic appeals to other potential members, presenting themselves as patriotic organizations filled with people who have already demonstrated an unquestionable commitment to their country through their military service. From a practical perspective, militia members without their own military experiences want to learn skills from former service members. As early as 2009, numerous militia members talked directly to me about a desire to learn skills from veterans about how to enhance their firearms handling, their land navigation techniques, and their ability to move together as a cohesive unit. Veterans with more specialized skills, such as experience handling explosives, may sometimes be sought out by radical groups who are fantasizing about or plotting violence. The most extreme groups may already have specific operational objectives for using veterans' knowledge and experiences against a variety of targets. What I personally believe is more concerning, however, is that I have much more commonly observed veterans actively seeking out militias without having to be recruited. These veterans have a pre-existing desire to share their military skills. These men, and all whom I have personally encountered are men, said that they are searching for a way to continue to serve their country after leaving the service. Part of what they are doing is also searching for a community that would appreciate, if not quite replicate, their service and expertise. Some veterans who are searching for a place to belong are driven by anger at the federal government, which they believe has betrayed them in some way. Those who are motivated by such anger often want to find a militia unit that is on the extreme end of the spectrum, one that at least claims to be ready for violent action. As Representative Banks noted earlier, veterans face a variety of challenges upon their return, including issues like high rates of homelessness and suicide that may seem more pressing than an arguably small numerical presence in extremist groups. From what I've observed, however, veterans' attraction to extremist groups has an important shared similarity with those other issues: the need to feel supported and included in a society where many civilians struggle to understand the veteran experience. It's difficult to quantify the degree of threat that extreme militias may pose in the future, but we can't downplay the possibility of violence from the extreme factions. In recent years, we've seen militia groups who usually decrease in size during Republican presidential administrations, instead increase in both size and intensity. This happened as both conspiracy theories and political rhetoric, starting at the highest level, inflamed militia members' core concerns about the safety of our nation and the integrity of various cultural characteristics that they value. We saw some groups like the 3%ers and the Oath Keepers, who began in part as a reaction to President Obama and perceptions of growing socialism, intensify their transition into operating in-person units who use their shared ideology to protest, armed and in person, in a variety of volatile situations. These groups are typically only loosely affiliated with each other in practice, but can easily draw on their common interests for collective action. We saw this come to fruition on January 6th, when different militia units, overt white supremacists, and individuals unaffiliated with any known groups acted toward the same end of breaching the Capitol. We have warning signs that something like this could happen when we witness militias who usually maintain clearer group boundaries, protesting alongside overt white supremacist groups and others with a known history of violence at numerous events throughout 2020. What is more, we have reason to believe that extremist units continue to search for like-minded individuals, including some disenchanted veterans who are willing to commit future violence. We cannot afford to overlook signals of extremism going forward, and I thank you for your attention to this issue.
Thank you, Dr. Cooter. I now call on Mr. Siegel for 5 minutes for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Bost, members of the committee. On behalf of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the landscape of domestic extremism and related efforts to recruit and attract veterans. Domestic violent extremism impacts the safety and security of all Americans, but understanding the specific danger it poses to our democratic institutions is a key to mitigating the threat. While extremist movements pose many problems to society, from spreading hate and intolerance to engaging in deadly violence, it is also concerning when adherents of extreme causes target the institutions dedicated to protecting the people of the United States. It's not lost on the American public that of the 600 or so individuals arrested for their role in the January 6th insurrection, at least over 50 were veterans, or that we have seen veterans become leaders of extremist groups, train extremists, and even engage in extremist violence. We continue to observe and document how extremist groups and movements seek to target veterans for recruitment. How and why they do that depends in part on the ideology. The nature of potential indicators varies from movement to movement, and sometimes even within a movement. We have seen a range of white supremacist groups expressed interest in adding veterans to their ranks because of their military skills and training, including violent paramilitary white supremacist groups like the Base and Atomwaffen, whose members participate in training camps to refine their survivalist tactics in preparation for a perceived impending race war. The membership application for the Base explicitly targets those with, quote, military experience, unquote, And in a February 2019, the group's founder and leader tweeted, quote, "Why do we ask applicants about military experience? The base is survivalism and self-defense network, two skills that are acquired through military training," unquote. As mentioned earlier, members of the anti-government extremist Oath Keepers focus on recruiting military, as well as police, by exploiting their career-related oaths to uphold and defend the Constitution. One of the militia's main area of focus is firearms and military-style training. They recruit former military because they hope they have the range of skills and expertise in subjects such as survival, reconnaissance, hand-to-hand combat. These skills can be used to train others. There are also Proud Boys who present themselves as a pseudo-paramilitary group and consistently engage in violent confrontations around the country. They include members who are veterans, some who hold leadership positions. We also know that violence is not the sole domain of any one extremist movement and is an issue across the ideological spectrum. Some left-wing extremist efforts to push back against those they oppose have at times served to normalize violence as well. But we also know that 75% of extremist-related murders in the United States, according to our data, over the past 10 years, have been carried out by right-wing extremists. We are seeing how extremists use the language of patriotism to further their reach, wrapping their agendas in the stars and stripes. And this language finds voice on a variety of social media and online platforms, providing a fertile environment for the hate, conspiracies, and disinformation to proliferate in so-called patriot groups and other spaces that animate real-world activity. To mitigate the threat of extremism, we must understand efforts to recruit our veterans, as well as our military and law enforcement more broadly, not just because of the erosion of trust that it creates, but because they have an outsized negative impact on the safety of our communities. We must also pay attention to the broader changing landscape of extremism, whether it's harassment or threats against school boards, elected officials, or healthcare workers. The front line against extremist activity and action is local. It is close to home, trying to creep into our institutions, eager to prey upon our heroes and our vulnerable. The issues of extremism in the veteran community is complex. And in closing, I urge the committee to consider how the Department of Veteran Affairs and related agencies can become better informed on the threat of extremists' attempts to recruit our nation's veterans, to help veterans in transition become more aware of those risks, and consider how we can help bolster veteran resilience in the face of attempted recruitment and radicalization. As we explore what can work, what has worked, and what is needed, we can better prepare America's veterans to reject extremist efforts to conscript them into the cause of hate and violence. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Siegel. Without objection, will have your full testimony and the full testimony of the previous panelists included in the hearing record. And now I recognize Dr. Byrick. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Bost, and esteemed members of the committee for the honor of inviting me to testify today on the critical issue of violent domestic extremist groups and the recruitment of veterans. My name is Heidi Byrick. I hold a PhD in political science from Purdue University, and I'm the co-founder of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. For more than 2 decades, I've extensively researched and published on white supremacist groups, militias, and other forms of extremist activity. A significant area of my work has been monitoring white supremacist and anti-government organizations that recruit active duty military and veterans. These organizations and their violence-inspiring beliefs pose a dire threat to our homeland, and we need to respond with equal vigilance. It's very important that nothing in my remarks today be taken to impugn the honorable men and women of the armed forces or the veteran community. Our nation and democracy are stronger and safer because of them, and I applaud the many military leaders and veterans who've made it clear that extremism has no place in the military. I'd also like to thank those veterans who acted with such bravery in protecting our capital and our democracy on January 6th. As the final speaker today, I'll try to sum up the threat that extremist groups pose to veterans in our country and offer a couple solutions. Since 2019, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the National Counterterrorism Center, the State Department, the ODNI, they've all agreed that far-right extremist groups pose our country's most serious domestic terrorist threat. Though other forms of extremist violence have risen in recent years, far-right extremist violence has been the most deadly and the place where radicalized veterans have mostly been found. Dozens of veterans have been arrested for their role on January 6th, but their involvement in extremist activities has been a problem for a while. As Dr. Jones mentioned in the earlier panel, it may also be growing. The University of Maryland has analyzed military backgrounds of individuals who committed extremist crimes from 1990 through the first 6 months of 2021 and found 354 individuals with military experience. The danger of leaving this unaddressed cannot be overstated because veterans make extremist groups and attacks more effective, unfortunately. Some of our country's most tragic events have been the mass attacks planned and successfully executed by veterans, not only Oklahoma City, but the 1996 Olympic Park bombing, the 2012 attack on a Wisconsin Sikh temple, and many others. Though radicalized veterans are few in number, their skills help attacks succeed. Recruitment of veterans has been a goal of white supremacist and anti-government groups for decades, and their aggressive tactics to do so, particularly online, work. According to one estimate, roughly 25% of active militia members are active duty service members and or veterans, and former soldiers have led violent white supremacist groups. Military training is seen as vital to achieving these groups' goals, whether that be a race war or a battle with the federal government. The reasons are obvious. The training soldiers have in tactics, weapons, bomb making, leadership, all of which may increase the possibility of a successful attack. The tactical knowledge these groups desire was on display January 6th, where members of extremist groups, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys that have been discussed today, used military formations to assault our capital. Veterans also convey a legitimacy on hate and extremist organizations and can make additional recruitment easier. The military is rightly one of the most trusted institutions in our society, and extremist organizations aim to leverage that trust for their own ends. Let me just speak very briefly about things that can be done to help with this situation. We clearly need better data about the nature of this threat, what it looks like, and data sharing across government agencies about the problem, for example, between the FBI and the Department of Defense. Some of these suggestions have already been mentioned earlier. Preliminary evidence shows that recruitment efforts strategically target and exploit vulnerable veterans, those who experience involuntary separation from the military, or those who believe their active duty service has gone unrecognized. We need to know more about the how and the why that veterans are radicalized and what can be done to stop those processes. Also, there needs to be a whole of service approach here, starting with screening procedures for new recruits into the military, regular education on the dangers of extremist groups for soldiers. Obviously, if we stop extremists from entering the ranks of the military, we are less likely to have radicalized veterans later. And the tradition to civilian life and the Department of Defense's activities there are of critical importance to bolster veteran resilience and also to let them know about the groups that try to recruit them. Veterans organizations matter here as well. Many spoke out against what happened on January 6th, and that mattered. And finally, the role of the VA. We hope that the VA can be a powerful entity here in stopping the extremist ability to recruit veterans. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Dr. Byrick. Without objection, your written testimony, along with all the other panelists, will be included in the hearing record in full. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. So I'll begin with you, Dr. Byrick. We've heard a lot of significant and insightful testimony this morning. And now that we've reached the end of both panels, I'm wondering, Dr. Byrick, if you could sum this all up for us. In particular, we've heard about these different groups, such as the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. What I want to know is, as an expert in the field, which of these groups do you think poses the greatest threat and why? And which of these threats keeps you up at night?
Well, what I'm most concerned about, there are obviously a range of extremist groups, but is the ones that have engaged in violence that are the ones that are the most concerning. So the Proud Boys, for example, and Orrin already mentioned this, have been involved in all kinds of violent activities across the country repeatedly, not just January 6th. That's the kind of organization that keeps me up at night, plus the lone wolf. Many of the mass attacks that we've seen committed by veterans, Oklahoma City being the most notable and the most deadly, are committed by lone actors who have been radicalized into white supremacist or anti-government beliefs, and then are willing to use violence to act on those beliefs.
Well, thank you. Mr. Siegel, I'd like to ask you the same question. The ADL studies a broad range of extremist activity. From what you've seen, which are the key threats that keep you up at night?
Thank you for the question. As I mentioned in my verbal testimony, 75% of extremist-related murders in the past 10 years have been carried out by right-wing extremists, and the majority of that has been at the hands of white supremacists. And so whether it's Pittsburgh or Poway or El Paso or elsewhere, we've seen mass casualty attacks from that movement, and that's a concern that we continue to have. I think what post-January 6th has shown us is that efforts to portray the government as a tyrannical, overreaching entity are also animating the types of extremists that you've heard from my co-panelists here, the anti-government oath keepers, militia groups. And so frankly, we don't have a luxury to ignore any form of extremism in this country, but those who are able to manipulate social media platforms to spread their message and recruit are the ones that keep me up at night.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Siegel. I now would like to yield back the rest of my time and recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Cooter, my first question is to you. Recognizing how often violent extremist groups adopt military culture, style, and gear and dress, how big of a problem do you think it is? We refer to it as a stolen valor in this violent extremist groups, dressing up, acting like veterans, even though they might not have the background as being in veterans. I'm a little bit older. I actually refer to them as the Rambo wannabes that seek out different groups like this. Have you seen that in your studies of people doing this?
I have seen that. Thank you for your question. What I see more commonly, though, is people who had attempted to be veterans, who, in other words, wanted to have a service experience, but didn't qualify for health or other reasons. And they're very aware of that boundary between themselves and real veterans. And that's part of the reason they really want to have veterans in their group, to have that more authentic experience and learn from them.
Yeah, I think we can probably see a lot of that as well. And this next question is for any of the panel. And this is, so what role do you think, because I believe it's in there and I'm sure you all understand that as well, something new that's out there is, and as affected us over the year, what role does social media and so-called big tech play in recruitment for violent extremists and the like? Because we've had this problem. It was mentioned by some of them, in Vietnam era. I grew up during that time, saw the problems that have occurred on our campuses, but it took more of a recruiting one-on-one and places where they would come together. Does big tech allow for a faster growth?
I'm happy to jump in and start. We know that the plots of tomorrow, the threats of tomorrow, are being hatched online today. And so the role of social media and online platforms in not only animating the narratives and grievances that motivate extremists, but that we know are linked to actions on the ground is critical. It's the lifeblood of these movements. And so, it's not unreasonable for users of these platforms to have an expectation that they all do more to stop the exploitation of those platforms, to spread that hatred, and to make it easier for extremists to communicate with each other and to target their enemies.
Right. So go ahead.
Ranking Member Bost, I think that this is a critical question, absolutely essential what you bring up. I agree with Mr. Siegel about the answers here. It's the online space that has transformed the recruitment abilities in ways that just couldn't exist in the 1990s. It was phone calls and fax machines and letters that would get you in touch with groups. We live in a completely different environment, and has made the problem of extremism, frankly, of all types, so much worse because of the way the social media companies in the online space has handled it.
Okay, then the next question is how can we help our veterans and all Americans stay safer online? And I hope that you've looked at the bill that I and Congresswoman Mace have put out there. I think it is, and we're encouraging our Democrat friends to get on as well. I think it's a way that we've got to realize and get accurate numbers so that we can actually combat and train veterans as they go through the TAP program or wherever, whether they're leaving DOD or somewhere by the VSOs, can be taught what to be aware of. And any other comments? But if not, I'll yield back the balance of my time, Chair.
Well, thank you. Well, let's allow the witnesses to respond. They want to respond.
I will just add to that question that, how do you make veterans be more aware of the efforts to manipulate them online? I think it's a similar question to how do we, prepare students and adults, frankly, as well, about that manipulation. And I think it's training, having critical skills training, but I think it's also being able to identify and call out what hate and extremism is. ADL has a hate symbols database, which provides examples of symbols and tattoos and code words that are commonly used. And I think that's a good place to start, educating all of the people that we want to bolster in terms of their knowledge, because that's going to be key in fighting against hate.
Thank you.
Any other responses?
Perhaps I'll just jump in for a moment, if I may. We heard from Dr. Miller-Idris in the previous panel about this idea of inoculation, particularly in the areas of misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. And just as social media and other internet-based communication platforms allow for extremists to reach one another more easily, they potentially offer a route for us to engage in some of this inoculation behavior. And I think that various agencies, whether it be the VA or VSOs, should investigate some of the research being done by some of Dr. Miller-Idris's colleagues at Peril at American University. I'm thinking particularly of Dr. Kurt Braddock, who's doing some really innovative work around inoculation in this space.
Well, thank you. I now will recognize Mr. Mcveigh for 5 minutes. Mr. Mcveigh. Mr. Mcveigh, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Do you think you can hear us?
I apologize, Chairman. Dr. Barish, it is always a privilege to welcome an expert with ties to Indiana to testify before the committee. If in your written testimony, you noted that VA has generally resisted calls to address the sources of radicalization among veterans, including online disinformation. Why do you believe VA has been resistant to combating violent extremism and online disinformation? And do you believe VA stance is changing?
Thank you so much for your question and for the shout out to Indiana. It's an important question you ask about this past reluctance to deal with this particular issue. I will have to say for some time in multiple administrations on different sides of the aisle, there has been a reluctance to take on the issue of radicalization, in particular when it relates to white supremacy and militia groups. And I think this might be a reflection of that. But I get a sense that there's a different feeling at the VA now. The secretary has talked about this, said he is working with other groups to address this. And I think the VA could play a powerful role, as it does in so many different issues, in helping veterans who are approached by extremist groups and also giving them the information that they need before such an approach might happen to, inoculate them from the possibilities of this having any effect. I think there's just a real lack of knowledge about the extremist groups that recruit veterans, what they believe, what they're up to, what their nature is, both for active duty service members and for veterans. And I feel that that the winds have changed and we may be seeing a better future on this front.
Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, also, the House Appropriations Committee has called on VA to establish a comprehensive evidence-based program to educate veterans about malign influences. I believe that this would be a step in the right direction. Having said that, what do studies of extremism tell us about the most effective strategies for combating violent extremism ideology online?
There's a range of issues when you talk about the online space. One of them starts with the social media companies, and what you're asking about is a big, very important question. The social media companies themselves have got to be much more consistent and transparent about the way they deal with content moderation and violence-inspiring ideas that they're hosting on their websites. Many of us will remember that, for example, Facebook did not remove accounts of the Proud Boys until far too late in the fall of 2020. That whole ecosystem needs a hard look at and frankly, congressional oversight to figure out what they're allowing to proliferate on their platforms and what they aren't. But the other side of this issue is informing veterans themselves, active duty troops, to be aware of what extremist content looks like, how it functions. So there's sort of a supply and demand side to this particular issue, both of which need to be addressed and dealt with.
And is the VA consulting with you and other experts on these topics and programs? If so, what has been the nature of those conversations?
Again, thank you for your question. I have not been consulted by the VA. I have spoken to some members in the various branches of the Department of Defense, in particular their investigative arms, about issues of extremism.
I thank you very much for your testimony today and to all the witnesses being here. With that, Chairman Takano, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. McVeigh. I understand that Mr. Cawthorn is trying to get on the platform. Until such time as we can get him technically on the platform, I'm going to now go to Mr. Brown for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask Mr. Siegel or Segal, in the fiscal year 22 NDAA, I offered an amendment that would address extremism in the armed forces. It included a provision that would require the Secretary of Defense to provide education materials to soon-to-be veterans via the Transition Assistance Program to defend against recruitment by extremist groups. You mentioned this program in your testimony as well. How else can the Transition Assistance Program be strengthened to help transitioning service members be prepared against the threat of recruitment by extremist groups? And as you're answering the question, perhaps you can address what additional tools and resources can we equip soon-to-be veterans with? And how can the VA and DOD better coordinate to prepare service members transitioning into civilian life to defend against recruitment by extremist groups?
Thank you for the question. Veterans are provided a range of resources during their transition from active duty to civilian life. Some of those resources involve mental health. Some involve other community-oriented resources that aim to support their ability to transition safely. These resources should include education on common extremism, extremist narratives, and referral opportunities for counseling, support groups, or other ways to be influencers for good and to promote hope over hate. Other than education and how extremists may attempt to reach them, referrals for counseling and support groups remain key. We have called for such research into these potential solutions as well, including looking into whether public health style prevention programs, such as those funded by DHS, may be transferable. And ADL would be happy to review those. And then lastly, there is a significant overlap between information that DoD would need to know for active service members and that which the Department of Veteran Affairs would need to know to provide services to veterans after they have separated. I'd recommend that they form a joint task force to share information and counseling and the resources there, and request that the departments be more transparent as well in how they see these challenges and what they're doing about it.
Thank you, Dr. Byrich. We last spoke about extremism in 2020 at a Military Personnel Subcommittee hearing in the Armed Services Committee. And I want to thank you for your assistance in assisting me in crafting the amendment in the NDAA to address extremism in the military, particularly with respect to improving data collection. As I know you're aware, you've spoken to the fact that the FBI has an international terrorist organization list, but it does not publish one for domestic violent extremist groups. How would you like to see the FBI coordinate with the VA related to data collection broadly as it relates to veteran participation in domestic violent extremist groups?
Thank you for the question. Also, thank you for that work that you did on the NDAA. It's so critically important. I think in general, we have had for some time now a breakdown in sharing of information between the FBI on evidence they have about veterans and extremist groups and other agencies generally. And that's already, in the public domain. And I think that needs to stop. There's also a general failure, from various cases, for example, around Atomwaffen, of sharing of information between the National Guard and the Department of Defense in general. And the whole data situation, I think, needs a really hard look at what data is being collected, what it tells us, how it's being shared in the appropriate ways. And I think that this is actually a really serious issue because without good data, and this was brought up in the prior panel, we don't really know exactly what it is we're looking at.
Right. And just a quick follow-up. How useful would it be for the FBI to have a formal list for domestic violent extremist organizations as it does international-based groups?
Thanks again for the question. I have to say I have some reservations on that front. The history of our country in terms of government blacklists can change shifting on the winds. I'm thinking about, for example, Martin Luther King being targeted by the FBI in the 1960s for legitimate activities. That said, there are a lot of organizations out there, representatives of them have been included on these panels, that have really good information about extremist groups that can be shared and looked at. And I would encourage that discussion to happen.
Thank you. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. I now call upon Representative Luria. Mr. Cawthorn still having trouble getting onto the platform. Ms. Luria, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Takano, and I want to thank our second panel of witnesses. And I'd like to first address this question to Mr. Siegel. We've talked a lot about violent extremism, and within that, we've seen an increased prevalence of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic incidences, the Tree of Life Synagogue, the events that happened here in my state of Virginia a few years ago in Charlottesville. And these ideas of the extremism that we see, it seems to me that they feed on racism, and racism feeds on fear-mongering. And even your own organization has been at the center of some controversy regarding this and been called racist itself for calling out these activities. And we talked a lot about social media, and through that, like individual targeting of these individual veterans. But I'd like to take a broader step back and maybe hear from our panel about how they feel that the mainstream media has sort of normalized these types of ideas, and especially starting with ADL, because this idea of the great replacement that was being used by one of the hosts on one of the major news, if you call it that, and commentary networks out there, that's being seen by so many Americans. So, it doesn't even take someone being in the deep holes of Twitter or Facebook or some social media platform where they're individually being targeted. There's some broad messaging using a lot of these undercurrent type messages, even before they could be targeted. So can we start with Mr. Siegel about how mainstream media is influencing this and making people, especially veterans, since we're talking about that, more susceptible?
Sure. I thank you for the question. I think the issue of normalizing the narratives and the tropes that we know not only animate violence, but are a requirement for many of the hateful agendas that many of the groups that we're concerned about, it is made worse when they find voice in our mainstream media, and frankly, any media. So we know certain online spaces are mainstream to those who primarily get their information and news in the online spaces, but there's still millions of Americans who are getting their cues and are engaging in sort of the public discussion through our mainstream media. And when we hear people who are going to echo the sentiments that we see in the extremist spaces, that's a huge concern. And I will say one last point here. We know that the extremists, including white supremacists, celebrate it when public pundits or talk show hosts are giving voice to their hate. So combating extremism, holistic approach, and calling people out who use their vehicles, public vehicles, to normalize that is certainly part of that effort.
Well, thank you. And I would add to that list of people for whom they applaud the public notice, and also former presidents. And I would like to open this to other members of the panel if you have any thoughts on mainstream media and perhaps how this is helping sort of normalize some of these messages before we get to the level of individual recruitment and targeting veterans.
I will just add, among the folks that I study, they attend to a variety of media sources, not just the social media platforms, not just mainstream media, but a variety of different sources. And they see themselves as being very critical of the messages that they hear, regardless of the source. But what I see is that more exposure equals more belief. So I do think that this is a very important question. And I'd echo everything that Oren was saying here as well.
Thank you. Dr. Jackson, did you want to comment, or Dr. Barrett?
I would just like to thank you for bringing up the issue of the Great Replacement as a particularly scary and noxious conspiracy theory, because it is what motivated attacks in Pittsburgh and El Paso and so on. And the fact that this has been coming from a quote unquote mainstream media outlet is particularly terrifying.
Thank you. Dr. Jackson?
I will just echo what my co-panelists said and say that I think that they've addressed this question very ably.
Well, thank you. And thank you to our panelists and for the work that you're doing on these issues. And I think this is an important part of the discussion, to understand all the sources of information that not only our veterans, but our communities more broadly are hearing, and how in the rare and dangerous cases, those can be transformed into violent activity, which I think is the purpose of our hearing today, to understand how we can prevent that and how we can keep our veterans who might be most vulnerable and susceptible to this type of messaging, to keep them safe and to go further, because as the purpose of this committee is to care for our veterans in all ways. So many of those people, maybe also people who need care of other types. And so to go back to our discussion with the first panel, I think this is part of a broader discussion into providing holistic and comprehensive care for our veterans. And I thank the chairman again for having this hearing.
Thank you, Representative Luria. I understand I have a number of members who wish to be recognized, but I'm going to prioritize those that have their cameras turned on. And Ms. Underwood is in the queue, and she's got her camera turned on. So Ms. Underwood, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is timely. The threat posed by domestic violent extremism is rising and rapidly evolving. One critical area of focus in combating these threats must be on the efforts of domestic violent extremist communities to recruit veterans to their hateful ideologies and violent methods, a trend that's despicable as it is dangerous. We need evidence-based solutions to address this issue. But before we can invest in evidence-based solutions, we need evidence. And when it comes to data on the recruitment of veterans by domestic violent extremists, there's still too much that we don't know. I'm so glad that Mr. Siegel, who leads the Center on Extremism at the Anti-Defamation League, has joined us. He's been such a great partner in my work to address these threats. And the center has provided really rich data sets on extremist incidents across the country that have furthered our understanding of the proliferation of domestic extremism beyond what current federal intelligence alone could provide. Mr. Siegel, as we attempt to answer questions about efforts by domestic violent extremists to recruit veterans to their cause and the effectiveness of those efforts, what are the important demographic data points that would be most important to collect and analyze about the veterans being targeted?
Thank you so much for the question. So I think the Office of the Director for National Intelligence, DHS, the FBI have released information within the last year about the top threat to Americans being domestic extremists, notably white supremacists.
Right.
Now, we need more transparency, including but not limited to the transparency provisions in the much needed Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. But I think that is a start. But when we're looking at the type of data that may inform our understanding about how veterans are being targeted, I think we have some tools that are useful clues as to where this might be happening. So I bring people's attention to the ADL heat map on our website, where we have 6 different data sets, including terrorist plots and attacks, extremist-related murders, events, flyering. These are all indicators of potential activity in communities, which may try to prey upon those in that area, including, of course, veterans. And so each one of our representatives here are able to look at their district, their state, and see for themselves some of the data, some of the activity that is happening in their area. And so I think
Mr.
that's
Siegel?
a first step. Yeah.
Yes, we're familiar with your current tools. We appreciate your tools. We use them. My question is, what new demographic data points do we need to be collecting nationwide and analyzing to give us the information to understand the nature of the threat to our nation's veterans?
So I think specifically to veterans, it's about how many veterans may have been involved in the activities that we are tracking. I think there is some data there, but it's not complete. I think there's data from veteran organizations themselves about internal information about what kind of trainings they're being provided in terms of preparing them to respond to those threats. That's a data set that would be useful too, and then be able to see how effective it is. So I think those are 2 ways in which we can try to better understand the issues within our veteran communities, and then find ways to actually push back against that.
Okay. One of the ways that we know that many veterans have been targeted and recruited is on these online settings where the extremist groups so often spread egregious disinformation targeting veterans. And in my work on the House Appropriations Committee, I've been working to address the rise in online extremism, including through report language that I advanced through the committee in July. My language directs the Department of Homeland Security to assess how an independent nonprofit clearinghouse could be established to proactively investigate public online extremist content while safeguarding civil liberties. Mr. Siegel, your center has been a national leader in this type of work. What lessons can we learn from monitoring online threats that would apply effectively to monitoring online recruitment of veterans by domestic violent extremists?
Mr. Siegel. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, we must do better in providing advance warning about some of the activities that we're seeing, and that's why we have proposed an independent clearinghouse as part of our Protect plan, in the hopes that it's not just scouring the internet looking for protected speech, but so that someone reviewing the dark corners of the internet can look for signs of attack. Only after criminal behavior is suspected would we expect this clearinghouse to make a referral. And frankly, the amount of threats and activity that are related to extremism are vast.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you for your, Ms. Underwood. I now recognize Mr. Cawthorn for 5 minutes.
Chairman Takano, it's normally my habit to start these hearings out by thanking you for holding this hearing, but I do not appreciate this hearing, sir. And Ranking Member Boss, I hope you'll indulge some frustration I have, because as I'm sitting here listening to the fact that our veterans are being derided, the people who have safeguarded our liberty are being derided and spit upon by members of Congress, it is truly disgusting. Now, if anybody says that there is a major movement of white nationalism inside of our military, I wholeheartedly say no to that. I wholeheartedly say that everything based on my evidence, and I did not serve, but I know many people who do. And the same sentiments from every single race that I speak to is that there is no racism in our military. If there is, it is very far and few between. For people to say that white evangelical Americans who are conservatives and who are in our military are racist is disgusting and wrong. Any Christian who is inside of our military literally worships a Middle Eastern man. To say that these people are racist is absolutely wholeheartedly false. Representative Lane had a great comment at the very end of her comments where she said that this committee is in the business of caring for our veterans. But I do not believe that this committee hearing that we're having today, where we are trying to paint every single veteran as if they are some kind of extremist, is right. I just heard Dr. Amy Cooter start with our opening statement, start attacking the idea of having militias in our country. And I understand that she used some special words and things to say that, oh, no, I'm not against all militias. But unfortunately, having a militia is a protected right within our Constitution under the Second Amendment. And I believe it is disgusting to say that there is extremism and that we need to root out extremists inside of our military, inside of our veterans. I will tell you right now, when I consider what's going on, and when we have seen many members of Congress and members of the Senate ask point blank to members of the Department of Defense to define the extremism that they are trying to root out, and they cannot give us a clear definition, it becomes clear the actual way that they're trying to find extremists is anybody who would vote for a Republican. The only extremism I am aware of that exists in a large manner inside of our military is an extreme level of patriotism. These men and women who put uniforms on to defend our rights and defend our country are heroes. And when they leave the military and our veterans, they should be honored with the gratefulness of an incredible nation that says, thank you for your service. Now, I apologize that I'm not in a formal office as many of you are with a flag behind me. But as you see behind me, this is my district of Western North Carolina in these mountains. I have tens of thousands of veterans. And for you to come here and members of Congress to say, oh, well, you know what? It's actually a high likelihood that people who are veterans, who are in militias, are actually extremists. That is disgusting. There are incredible numbers of militias inside of my district. And I'm very proud to say that these are people who want to safeguard our liberty in case we ever have a tyrannical government that rises up. And my friends, I am disgusted and saddened to see that we have members of Congress deriding veterans. You should all be ashamed of yourself. Dr. Cooter, I would like to point a question to you. Are you anti-militia?
Mr. Cawthorn, I believe that you actually missed all of our opening statements, and I would encourage you to review the film on that, because if you would have heard me, you would have heard me say that I've been a gun owner since I was 21. I grew up in the foothills of Appalachia, and I have very close personal contacts with members who are, or with militia members across the country. I'm frequently accused of being a militia apologist because I actually try to focus very frequently on how many of them are law-abiding folks. But the focus today is on that extreme element and the potential danger that that extreme faction specifically can pose to our veterans and to our country.
Thank you very much for backing that up and saying that you don't think that many members of militias are extremists. I'm glad that you're a gun owner. I'm happy to practice your Second Amendment rights. I did watch your opening statements, and I was just saddened to hear that this entire committee hearing is about finding extremists inside of our veterans. Our veterans right now, specifically the ones who served in Afghanistan, are feeling an incredible amount of sadness and of shame of the way that our government has handled themselves. And so to say that now we're going to start looking for extremists within their ranks, this is another demoralizing move, and it is wrong. And Chairman Takano, I'm very sad, and normally I believe that you are a great patriot. But to hold this committee hearing, I believe is completely unjust. I believe it's completely wrong to characterize as if there is anything more than a fractional percentage of members of our veterans community who are extremists and who hate this country and who hate people because of their skin color. It is wrong and it is not true. Stop looking for extremism inside of our military because it does not exist. Give the people the honor that they deserve. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cawthorn. I now recognize Dr. Ruiz for 5 minutes. Dr. Ruiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Jackson, some individuals believe groups such as the Oath Keepers have been misunderstood and that they are pro-Constitution and pro-freedom and not anti-government. Do you believe this to be the case, or do you believe that the Oath Keepers are an anti-government extremist group with a propensity for violence?
Thank you for your question. I describe Oath Keepers as an anti-government organization. While it is true that there are isolated cases of members of the organization expressing support for elected officials or for other people who serve in government, the overarching theme of Oath Keepers as an organization is the perception that the federal government and some state governments and local governments are tyrannical, are prone to overreach, and that the proper response to policies with which they disagree is conflict, which may include the use of violence. As I mentioned in my oral testimony, they have not hesitated in the past to either take their guns to various situations or to publicly state that they are prepared to do so.
Additionally, the Oath Keepers state that they defend the Constitution and fight against what they deem unconstitutional by the United States government. And under Article 3 of the Constitution, the power of judicial review is vested in the Supreme Court. Isn't that correct?
I will say here that I am not a lawyer, and I defer to legal experts to
Well, I
deal
think
with
you.
the.
I think you understand that we have three branches of government, and the judicial branch interprets what is constitutional and what is not constitutional. Correct?
That is certainly my understanding.
Okay, so they're the arbitrators of which is built in our Constitution, of what was defined as either unconstitutional or not constitutional. So if the Oath Keepers, therefore, if they determine in their view what is constitutional and not constitutional and act accordingly, either through violent militia, armed extremist means, or by not following the laws or policies that are put in place, then aren't they undermining the role of the Supreme Court within our Constitution and therefore undermining the Constitution itself?
I would agree with that statement. There is one of the foundations of the American way of life is rule of law. And when individuals take it upon themselves to empower themselves above judicial bodies to interpret what the law is in contravention of those political institutions, that undermines the rule of law in the country.
Correct. And I think that wouldn't those individuals who are armed and organized and follow this this philosophy of taking it upon themselves to determine what is constitutional and not, and undermining the Constitution and the judicial branch role, wouldn't you say they would become more dangerous because of their violent tendencies?
I guess I'm wondering what you're thinking of as more dangerous. Certainly they are dangerous. People who are willing to use their
and the
Sure.
violence sent and also in undermining our democracy. So let me ask you this question: how long have they been doing this? You had mentioned that they had activities in 2013 and 2014. How long have we known, or had it been known to the public, that they held these extreme views and were pro-militia and were single-handedly determining what was part of their what they thought was constitutional or not?
Oath Keepers as an organization has been around since 2009, but I really do want to come back to something I said in my statement, which is that Oath Keepers is part of a broader anti-government movement that has much deeper historical roots in the nation. This is not something that's new. It's been a threat in the past, and it continues to be a threat today.
Can you review what their activities were in the year 2013 and 2014?
I would be happy to talk with you about that. I don't want to try to
you
recall those
mentioned
things off the top of my head.
Well, you mentioned it in your testimony, so we can review your testimony on that. But it seems to me that they had these militia, anti-government, extreme views, even in 2013, trying to organize what they determined was constitutional or not constitutional, correct?
When the group launched in 2009, that was the underwriting theme of why they launched. That was their motivation, this perception of federal tyranny.
Okay, thank you. I ran out of time. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Ruiz. And I'll call on Mr. Gallego for 5 minutes. Mr. Gallego, are you? Did he leave the platform? Okay, I saw him before. I should have checked to see if his camera's on. I do not see any more members seeking recognition. So I will therefore thank our second panel of witnesses. I want to thank each and every one of you for your attendance at today's hearing and for the rigorous work that you do in your research and monitoring. I will now ask the ranking member if he has any closing remarks that he'd like to make.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank each one of join you in thanking each one of our witnesses for sharing their perspective with us today, as well as the witnesses just described, the violent extremists that do exist across the political spectrum. As lawmakers, we have the responsibility to do more than just talk about the problems. We have a responsibility to fix them. So once again, that is why Congresswoman Mace and I introduced H.R. 2326, the Veterans Cyber Risk Awareness Act. Our bill will help answer some of the unanswered questions about dangers posed by violent extremists who may target veterans online. And it will empower veterans with the information they need to protect themselves and their families. The bill is supported by veteran service organizations, including the DAV, the VFW, the Wounded Warrior Project, the SVA, and the PVA. And it was considered during a subcommittee on technology modernization legislative hearing last week.
One comment, I sent you back some of my edits.
Mr. Chairman, that HR, I'm going to ask if we can ask for a commitment that HR 2326 will be included in the agenda markup on October 27th, if at all possible.
Ranking Member Boss, I can't commit to that at that time. I understand that our respective staffs are in discussions, but I can't commit to that specifically. But I can commit that our respective staffs are communicating about the bill, and I appreciate that you've been putting some thought. You and Representative Mason put some thought behind this.
Well, I'm hoping that we can get it on to as soon as possible. We're listening to what is being said. I think that the groups themselves and many of the witnesses says these are the type of things we could do, and we've identified that there's a real problem. And I think that hopefully within the next week or two, we can talk and get our staffs to talk to try to move forward with that bill. I believe that it at least is something that's already drafted in place that we can move forward and hopefully work on the real issue and then get back to the other issues that we need to deal with the Veterans Administration and the VA. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. I certainly appreciate the gravity that you bring as a Marine, a veteran yourself, and the distinguished veteran family from which you hail. And I certainly appreciate the spirit in which we conducted today's hearing. We learned about the pernicious threat from domestic violent extremist groups targeting our veterans for recruitment. These groups share a singular characteristic: the propensity for violence. And they specifically target veterans for recruitment to acquire the combat experience, weapons training, and tactical and logistical expertise that they believe will enhance their violent capabilities. Mr. Siegel and Dr. Jones have provided compelling testimony and empirical data on the recent sharp spike in extremist activity. And while the increase is reflected across the full breadth of the political spectrum, it is disproportionately concentrated on the far right. And I want to emphasize that we're not ignoring that this propensity can and does exist on the left end of the spectrum, but we have to, I think, look objectively at the data, and it shows that within recent years, it is disproportionately concentrated on the far right. As our other witnesses have testified, the specific domestic extremist groups discussed today, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and the 3 Percenters, and the militia movement, share a hostility towards government authority. For some of these groups, their ideology is based on their own warped and false interpretation of the Constitution. The combination of anti-government sentiment, unfounded interpretations of constitutional rights and responsibilities, and an underlying propensity for violence is a noxious mix that should concern every American citizen. Engagement with these domestic violent extremist groups has already led to significant harm to veterans, including numerous veterans being arrested or incarcerated, losing jobs, and sometimes even losing their families. Veterans have been physically harmed and sometimes even killed through their participation with such groups. The negative impact of these domestic violent extremist groups on veterans is clear. Now that we have a preliminary introduction to the landscape of domestic violent extremism, I look forward to continuing our examination of how these groups seek to recruit and radicalize our veterans. Before we can best understand how to identify, intervene, and assist veterans that have become entangled in these groups, we need to carefully examine the many factors that can contribute to an honorable and patriotic veteran becoming susceptible to recruitment by extremists. We must look carefully at the role of disinformation and conspiracy theories and the ongoing multiplier effect of social media. But even beyond that, we must also consider how the valuable work that our subcommittees are doing on healthcare, mental health, employment, and education can perhaps be instructive on this issue. Most importantly, we need to continue to prioritize this issue and work diligently to shine a spotlight on the threat posed by domestic violent extremist groups and their targeted recruitment of veterans. As Colonel Plensler and Mr. Butler testified, we have valuable resources within the veterans and VSO community, and we must engage these partners to develop a comprehensive approach to tackling violent extremism. I also want to reiterate what I stated in my opening remarks, that this issue is about violence, not political positions, parties, or opinions. Addressing the threat of domestic violent extremism, and particularly the implications of this threat for veterans and their families, must be a bipartisan issue. And I hope that our committee is able to focus on the underlying issues without being distracted by partisan bickering. I'm committed to working with Ranking Member Bost and other members of our committee on both sides of the aisle to continue examining this issue, its underlying causes, and potential solutions and strategies. Additionally, I hope that we can identify opportunities to partner with our congressional colleagues on adjacent committees, including Armed Services, Homeland Security, and Oversight and Reform, to explore broader initiatives on this most critical threat. And finally, all members will have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material. And again, thank you for appearing before us today, and this hearing is now adjourned.